Chapter 739. Lionel's hands outlined Aina's silhouette. Her figure was so much fuller that he felt as though he could lose his fingers in the softness of her flesh. By the time he grabbed handfuls of her ass, he felt his breathing had already grown heavy. Even experiencing her touch now, he had a hard time fathoming how something could feel so good, so springy, so elastic. It had just a touch of firm muscle, only to be surrounded by a supple flesh that was beyond words. Ow! Aina pulled back, biting Lionel's lip in acute retaliation. If you pull any harder, you'll rip them off. Lionel laughed when he heard these words. Aina's voice had a subtle change to it after her transformation. The best way Lionel could describe it was like two silk sheets gliding against each other. Her cadence seemed to tickle at his ears, enticing him with every step. He really could barely hold back. But this time he managed to control himself. One day, when the time was right, he would taste her ripeness. And hopefully by then, the issues the two of them had yet to address would also be concluded. Neither of them seemed eager to speak on these things, but for the first time, Lionel didn't feel like he was running from it. Rather, he simply didn't know how to put what he was feeling into words, and Aina seemed to be the same way. But Lionel wasn't worried. Were all relationships nothing but smooth sailing? Even with his limited experience, Lionel didn't believe so. There would always be a push and pull, an effort both parties had to put in. Given enough time, Lionel was confident that they'd be able to take that step together. And when that day came, he would definitely put a baby in this goddess. After all, he had to make sure everyone knew that she was his. Lionel suddenly felt a pinch at his waist. What nasty thoughts are you thinking about? Lionel was stunned before he burst into a fit of laughter. It seemed that Aina's senses had become almost too good after her curse retreated. It was like she could practically read his mind now. Nothing much, just thinking of marking some territory, Lionel said with a devious smile. Territory? Territory now? Aina blinked quite adorably, however her gaze seemed to hide a dangerous light. Of course, I have to mark you off properly. We wouldn't want someone else trying to claim you, right? How embarrassing would that be? I see. I think it's better if we mark you off first. Not as territory though. I think you'd be a good little puppy, or get you a nice leash. Wouldn't want you going around to mark other territories that weren't yours, right? How embarrassing would that be? Aina's eyes blinked with a beautiful twinkling light. Her smile was gorgeous to an extreme. The mental pressure of her gaze was so strong that Lionel almost asked her where the leash was so he could go and get it. The time for the opening of the Valiant Heart Zone came quickly. Usually, there would be a few weeks to even month buffer period to allow those who would enter time to prep and prime themselves. But this time, it felt as though everything was being sped along at an accelerated pace. The chosen time for the zone's opening was the day following the selection. Since of the participants that were chosen, only a single one of them suffered injuries, it was decided that time for rest wasn't needed. What was surprising though, was this singular injured student was none other than Radley's, who had managed to claim the fourth and final spot for himself. After Lionel had taken out the Bear Rose members, the landscape had shifted. However, it definitely shouldn't have shifted enough for Radley's to claim a spot. After all, there were still the remaining King of Ors members, there were the Severed Heart faction members that hadn't made a move, and on top of that, there were still the other members of the Hero faction. It could be said then, that though Lionel's action had undoubtedly helped Radley's, if he hadn't had such strength of his own, he would have never come so far. Such a thing would have left Lionel feeling intrigued. If he had known about it, that is. Neither Lionel nor Aina had taken a step into the outside world for about a day now, and were simply enjoying each other's company. The matters of what was happening here wouldn't be known to them until they actually appeared. At this moment, though, many were already gathering around the Valiant Pillars. The ceremony for entry into the Valiant Heart Zone wasn't one they got to see often, so many didn't want to miss it. Beyond this, though, there were some small benefits to be gained by being near the entrance. It was said that those nearby could be blessed by the aura of the Valiant Pillars, allowing them some minor breakthroughs. Though their gains wouldn't be anywhere near as good as the youths who entered, it was at least something, right? Still, rather than being filled with an excited air, the atmosphere was quite solemn. At the center of the pillars stood a group of elders. But one singular man stood out amidst them all. This man was none other than the current head of the organization, Hutchin. Even given his age, his body rippled with vitality, his bronzed muscles shimmering beneath the rising sun. Since this man was still silent, no one dared to breathe a word. "Can't you at least let me be a lion or tiger pet or something? Why a puppy of all things? This is spousal abuse. Who's your wife?" The two voices weren't very loud, but the second one especially seemed to grip at all their hearts. Never had they heard a voice so soothing and enticing. Rather than reprimanding, many couldn't help but crane their necks to see where it had come from. But what they saw left them all at a loss. In that moment, Lionel might as well have been invisible despite the fact he held her hand. The two descended down the mountain pass, but the world seemed to revolve around just one of them despite the fact she wore a mask and her figure was hidden behind a black military uniform. Chapter 740. Lionel was speechless. How Aina was still drawing so much attention, even while wearing her mask, was beyond him. To Lionel, he didn't particularly care how the world saw Aina. When she chose to wear her mask out today, he hadn't said a word. After all, to the current Aina, the mask was about more than just hiding her face. She treated it like a present to be treasured, much like the necklace he had given her for her birthday. Plus, she wasn't quite used to her new face yet. Rather than having to waste her time talking and explaining things to people she didn't care about, she would rather just hide herself completely and leave her looks for the only one who mattered. To make things worse, Aina had even covered up most of her body wearing her black military uniform once again. Of course, this was because Lionel had tactlessly ripped away her valiant heart outfit during their battle. But one would have thought that this would make her even less conspicuous. Yet, all it took was just a single word from her in range of the crowd's hearing for hundreds of pairs of eyes to land on her, as though a pack of lustful wolves. It truly wasn't their fault, though. Aina's mental coercion was on a level these students, and even the elders, had never experienced before. Her every action seemed to put them into a trance. She wasn't even swaying her hips as she moved, yet her gait mesmerized them all nonetheless. Lionel's lip twitched, his eyes narrowing into a glare. It was only after his own presence solidified that many were snapped out of their daze, looking toward him with a hint of apprehension. Even at that point, though, it was hard not to wonder where this woman had come from. It was only those who recognized the blue-veined mask Aina wore that seemed to make the connection. But even then, they were greatly confused. Could a person undergo so many changes in just one night? Lionel and Aina made it to their designated location within the mountain pass. Technically, they weren't late, but it seemed that everyone was so eager to get this done that they had all come early. This even included the likes of Raylion and Hephaestus, who one would have assumed would come last. This only meant, then, that regardless of what Lionel wanted, the path of him and Aina was followed even down to the final moment. Eventually, 12 youths stood before the elders of Valiant Heart. Elder Magneral stepped forward. Clearly, it was still her duty to complete the last rites for this event. However, at this moment, she was greatly confused. "You. Who are you?" Magneral was trying her best to keep her calm, honestly. Given the current situation, she couldn't snap and rant like she wanted to. After all, they were in the presence of the head. And although Raylion had been causing quite some stirs in recent months, there was no one who could shake his position. Even Raylion was very far from doing so. However, even if she couldn't do as she pleased, that didn't mean she wasn't inwardly seething. Of course, she recognized Aina's mask. But was she also supposed to just believe that this person was Aina just because of this? For all she knew, Lionel had had this harlot wear this mask so that he could try to sneak her in. But, not only was this woman not wearing the official garb of their organization, but she was clearly not Aina. She was much taller, her demeanor seemed different, her ability felt different, and even her voice had undergone a subtle change. To Magneral, Aina's current voice sounded like someone who was trying their best to sound like her, and was just missing the mark by a small tidbit. That small tidbit of difference was the reason why all these men, and even the women, couldn't take their eyes off of her. The elders looked at this situation with a frown. The selection had happened for a reason. They couldn't just allow anyone into their most valuable treasure. Of course, at this moment, Things were a bit different. Whereas usually the topmost echelon of elders would be missing, they were here now. As such, those that knew of Lionel's true identity were likewise here. Looking toward one another, they saw a tinge of helplessness in their eyes. If Lionel wanted to bypass their rules and bring just a single person in, they should just allow it, right? Head Hutchin turned his gaze toward Lionel. For the current youth before him, this gaze was still heavy. In fact, Lionel seemed to notice it immediately and looked up. For the first time, Lionel and this mysterious head of valiant heart met face to face. But Lionel felt that this man was difficult to read. "I am Aina Brazing," Aina replied softly. Toward this response, Magneral's brow only furrowed deeper. Was this harlot really still trying to fool her? Magneral looked toward Lionel, a fury hardly hidden in the depths of her eyes. Her precious disciple had fallen for this bastard, and he had actually betrayed her like this. How could she not be furious? If it was up to her, she would cut Lionel down where he stood. Lionel felt this murderous gaze too, but toward this he could only bitterly smile. This really was Aina. How else was he supposed to prove this? It was at that moment that Aina pulled her mask off. For an instant, the air seemed to come to a grinding halt. Ah, damn it. Lionel clicked his tongue. Aina rolled her eyes and ignored him as her body began to change. A looming curse energy formed into a fog around her face, obscuring the enchanting view. Her body shrunk, her military uniform downsizing along with it. "Do you recognize me now, teacher?" Aina spoke in her former voice. At that point, Magneral was stunned into silence. Chapter 741. It's live, people, this is not a drill. Official Vampire Empress Aina art available on my Instagram right now, smiley face, @Ospec_. Can't believe I'm sharing these goodies with you all. Should have kept her to myself. After finding a path to cure her curse, Aina chose not to get rid of it completely. She had complete dominance over it with her ability, and could continue to use it as she had in the past to help with her training. Doing something like exploiting its effects for a moment to prove her identity was as easy as breathing, even though it put her in an uncomfortable position for a few moments. Not long later, though, she returned to her true form, the form that left her feeling the most comfortable. Like this, she felt as though she could destroy a mountain range with a step and hold the world in the palm of her hands. For a moment, that flawless countenance appeared again. Her shapely nose, the gentle slope of her jaw, her willowy brows and slender neck. It was all perfect to an extreme. But it only appeared for just a moment before she blocked it all with her mask. Maybe some of the most stunned people by this change other than Magneral were the likes of Balthorn, Radleys, and the other freshmen. Radleys still remembered making fun of Lionel for his poor choice in women, while Balthorn very clearly remembered why it was that Lionel didn't like her very much in the first place. But now, it felt like this woman they had once poked fun of had become an untouchable goddess. Hephaestus, who stood in the line of 12 youths, raised an eyebrow. He had never thought that the girl he had picked up actually had a true appearance like this. If it hadn't been for Aina's less than optimal looks, the method they used to try to put Lionel in his place would have been very different. At this point, let alone Hephaestus, even Raylion's heart, which was usually as calm as the unmoving surface of a lake, woke up for just a moment. Hephaestus grinned a toothy grin. If they thought that it was all sunshine and roses after entering the zone, they would be sorely mistaken. Lionel, sensing Hephaestus' gaze, looked over. Lionel's eyes were placid, his demeanor completely unmoved by the toothy grin he saw. Instead, his gaze shifted down to the twin daggers by Hephaestus' waist, his lip curling with disdain. Hephaestus froze. The words Lionel spoke all those months ago about how pathetic his weapons were suddenly rang in his ears like a furiously ringing bell. Outside of his control, his face suddenly burned hot as though Lionel's gaze alone carried a fiery heat. Hephaestus remembered exactly the kind of contempt he had treated Lionel's statement with back then, only to find out that Lionel had meant every word of it. Lionel shook his head, a look of pity lighting his eyes as he looked away. But this only infuriated Hephaestus even more. "Boy, I'll make sure you pay." Lionel ignored Hephaestus' heated gaze. As far as he was concerned, let alone dealing with him, his lovely girlfriend probably didn't need any help at all to all but solo them. Lionel didn't know where Aina's limit lied at this moment, but he knew that it was most definitely not shallow. At that moment, Magneral and the other elders finally recovered. Little Aina. Your curse, it's lifted? Aina nodded. My boyfriend helped me find a way. Magneral opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of Aina's enchanting voice saying the word boyfriend seemed to shatter the budding fantasies of countless youths. That's good. Magneral squeezed out a smile. Though it seemed forced due to her irrational hatred of Lionel, there was still a wave of genuineness found within her eyes. Clearly, she was very happy for Aina. I guess this old bat isn't so bad after all, Lionel thought with a smile. Still, Magneral was confused. The person that should be happiest about this lifted curse should be Aina. But why did she sound like she was speaking of just another matter? It seems that there is indeed something weighing heavily on this young girl. Magneral sighed. She had known that Aina was carrying a heavy weight long ago. She could only hope that Lionel could help her bear some of the burden. Magneral nodded. Since these matters have been settled, we can move on to important matters. Magneral stood straight, regaining her dignified air. These matters have been a barely hidden secret for a long while, but the elders have decided to speak of them in blunt terms. Our valiant heart is at a crossroads. We face internal enemies in the Oryx and external enemies in the Milky Way. We have sat at the top for a long while, and the beasts chewing at our scraps have become restless, wanting a larger piece of the pie. Magneral's words were simple, but they seemed to make the blood of the crowd boil. Who would ever want things that were rightfully theirs snatched away by another? This valiant heart zone to my back represents the pride of my valiant heart mountain. It is our most treasured possession, and the light we use to guide the leaders of the next generation. When you enter, I hope you understand the important role you play, and I hope that you grasp every opportunity presented to you. I will not lie. The valiant heart zone is not without danger. The longer a zone is forcefully held open like this as opposed to clearing it, the more variables can appear. Our valiant heart zone is especially susceptible to this because it is a variant zone that reflects the future. Variant zones are meant to be the easiest and safest zones to enter. However, our valiant heart zone has long since stopped being such a thing. In my heart, I wish for you all to enter as children and exit as men and women. To enter as foot soldiers and exit as generals. You are the pride of our valiant heart, our future. Magneral's voice resonated through the quiet mountain pass, a heavy atmosphere only growing heavier at that moment. Go forward and claim what is yours. The valiant pillars began to quake, an overwhelming surge of energy descending from above and crashing down toward the 12 youths. This force had every intention of forcing them to their knees. Chapter 742. In the face of such overwhelming pressure, Lionel and Aina were unmoved. If before it had been difficult for Aina to climb this mountain pass, at this current instant, she felt like she was walking through field of fragrant breeze. Hand in hand, the couple glided forward, a number of the other 12 following along with them. Counting the number of individuals who took this pressure in stride, there was Hephaestus, Raylion, Sail, and 2 others that Lionel did not recognize. But from what it seemed like, one of them was from Bear Rose and the other was from Severed Heart. Among those struggling, there was the remaining member of the former Valiant Hall, a member of Bear Rose and Severed Heart, along with Radlease. Of all these, there was just one person Lionel didn't account for, and he was the 4th individual to gain a spot of entry alongside Lionel, Aina and Radlease. And that person was King of Ors Seriath. Seriath seemed to be at the very center of the pack. He didn't seem to be mightily struggling, but he also didn't seem to be having an easy time either. Even to Lionel, this in-between state seemed genuine. If Seriath was faking it, he'd have to be on a completely different level entirely. Chapter 743. Feel bad saying even have a real upload schedule and quota now. Sorry guys, sad face. Thanks for sticking with me, love. Lionel's eyes narrowed, but he didn't even have the time to process what was really going on before a certain agile shadow flickered toward his back. Since Lionel and Aina had entered first, despite the sheer size of the hall, the remaining 10 members were all following to their backs. So, it wasn't surprising that they tried to take such a chance. Lionel's eyes sharpened, his palm flipping over to reveal a silver arrow as he quickly whipped backward. Sparks flew as metal clanged. Hephaestus bore down on Lionel with a toothy grin, his twin daggers having pierced toward the latter's heart. Yet, Lionel was clashing with his reinforced arrow, and had caught Hephaestus' wrist with his other hand. Feeling Hephaestus' strength personally for the first time, Lionel's gaze couldn't help but narrow. Even with his tear metal body, he would have been blown away had he not immediately reinforced himself with Four Seasons Realm Universal Force. Though this long-armed, hyper-muscular man was an annoyance, there was no doubt that he had real strength. Chapter 744. Chapter 744. Targets. Lionel's mind calculated many things in a split instant. To be able to create a hold in this sort of marble was a feat in and of itself. It took strength beyond tier 8 alone. However, this was just the beginning. Creating a hole was one thing, but doing it so perfectly that no cracks were formed in its creation was a completely different matter. It showed a level of ease that made one's spine tingle. There were two last factors that would truly make one shocked. The first was the speed. Between Lionel sensing Raylion's intention and the actual execution, there was no more than a split moment. The second was the distance. Raylion had been able to complete that near-instantaneous attack from over 10 meters away, and seemingly without a hint of fatigue. Everything about his actions was nonchalant and casual. Lionel took a deep breath, using the momentum of his explosive step backward to glide along the marble back to Aina's side. It was only then that he looked up and gazed toward Raylion. Without a word, he flipped his palm over. Many eyes narrowed when they saw the appearance of the small disc, thinking that Lionel was going to do something with it. After all, which of them here dared to underestimate such a high-level force crafter? Who knew what sort of gadgets he had? However, they only got more nervous when they saw Lionel's lips move, but no sound traveled to them. What's his ability? Ping. Subject: Raylion telekinesis. Evolution stage. Tier 7 bronze. When Lionel heard this, his brows furrowed. What is his ability index? Ping. Replying to seed. 2-star amplification stage. Lionel took in a breath. Now he understood. He had already gone through the ability index once and memorized it all. The telekinesis ability index was separated from lowest to highest: control, strength, amplification, and finally sublimation. For Raylion to be at the 2-star amplification stage, it meant that he was one sub-level away from the very peak of the amplification stage. It could be said that in terms of progression in his ability, he wasn't too far away from Lionel, and the fact he reached this level while still in the bronze grade spoke to the potential for growth he still had. This was extraordinarily rare, exceedingly so, for a person born within a fifth-dimensional world. From what Lionel understood, control was the weakest. This was the level Aina's good friend Yuri was at with her ability, at least when it was initially awakened. This level allowed one to enforce control over things outside of one's body. The next step, strength, took this a level beyond. Strength represented the ability to enforce more power with your telekinesis than your body could alone. As one might expect, the power of this level varied greatly from person to person. But usually this strength was not small. Even a petite young girl, who could hardly move a 20-kilogram weight on her own, might be able to shatter boulders 10 times her size after reaching this level. Then there was the third level. This was Raylion's level. At this stage, the amplification stage, one would gain a subtle and fine control over their telekinesis that allowed them to apply it directly to their body without risking harm. It was this subtle and precise control that allowed Raylion to imprint such a hole into the ground without causing even a crack to spread. It was also this control that allowed him to give form to his mental strength, making Lionel feel as though a steel pillar was falling upon him from above. Lionel's lips curled into a smile. This ability was indeed worth all the hopes the elders had pinned onto him. Lionel was even a bit jealous. It was just a shame that this Raylion had chosen to be his enemy for reasons that still made little sense to Lionel himself. This Raylion seemed to think that Lionel cared about what little authority controlling this organization would give him, when the reality was, Lionel didn't care about Valiant Heart at all. At that moment, Hephaestus slowly pulled himself up from the ground. his pupils having mutated into slits. It was clear that now he was truly serious, his gaze practically boring holes into Lionel. However, Lionel wasn't looking at him at all. Rather, from start to finish, Lionel's eyes were trained onto Raylion, who also had his eyes locked onto him. Putting his dictionary away, Lionel looked away from Raylion and back toward the bronze soldiers that were blocking their path forward. Then he looked toward the group of 10 before him and Aina again. Did they really have to kill two? But what if in the end there was only him and Aina left? Would this damnable place ask him to kill her? How far did it want to go, exactly? The best decision for Lionel would be to kill these opponents and place them within his snow globe. If he was lucky, then the zone wouldn't register them being alive and allow them to pass. However, how would he convince these people to do such a thing? The simple answer was that he couldn't. One way or another, he'd have to defeat them first. Dealing with Raylion with how flexible his ability was right now was impossible in such a chaotic battle. That likewise meant that Hephaestus was also off the board. This meant that there were 8 people he could possibly eliminate right now. The atmosphere grew heavier and heavier. The weakest among them felt cold sweat trickling down their brows, their fingers twitching. Many of them seemed to be about to make the first move out of sheer nervousness, unable to take the mental pressure that was bearing down on them. It was in that exact instant that Raylion and Lionel suddenly moved in unison. However, their targets were far outside of everyone's expectations. Bang! Bang! Lionel's eyes narrowed, slowly lowering a bow that had appeared so quickly people hardly registered that it had been there. With a crash, the 2 bronze projections shattered into motes of light that surged toward the two. Lionel and Raylion both reached out a hand, snatching their rewards out of the air. Chapter 745. Chapter 745, Resemblance. It's live people, this is not a drill. Official Vampire Empress Aina art available on my Instagram right now, smiley face, @ospec_. Can't believe I'm sharing these goodies with you all. Should have kept her to myself. The bronze light slowly coalesced, forming in a transparent orb. It looked no different from a polished crystal ball, except for the faint light it gave off. Lionel rolled the ball between his fingers, a curious light in his eyes. As though sensing something, his hand suddenly squeezed into a fist, shattering the orbs of light and causing a mysterious energy to surge into his body. The moment Lionel felt this energy, his eyes narrowed. Now that Lionel had learned his lesson, he no longer used soul force, at least in its normal form. Whenever he deployed his internal sight or used his magic, it was now all controlled by his dream force. Over time, he came to realize that this did more than just give him a basal boost to his abilities. There were some more interesting and insightful tidbits as well. For example, when Lionel used his internal sight now, he felt that he was more sensitive. It wasn't just that his range had grown explosively, but he felt like his attention to detail was far greater. If he used his internal sight to smell, Lionel felt that he was even better than most beasts at this point. And that was just one instance. So when Lionel observed the changes to his body now, his attention to detail was far greater. He could see his blood moving through his veins and arteries. He could see nerve signals firing within his nervous system. He could even see the perforations in his bone leading to his marrow. As a result, the moment the energy entered his body, Lionel almost instantly understood what it did. It was identical to the energy he received from the puppet master, though in far lesser quantity and quality. This energy was able to open up the path of bottlenecks that lay before him. Albeit to a very small extent, he felt the bottleneck to his Tier 5 metal body loosen just a small nudge. A nudge he might not have even noticed before. Lionel nodded to himself. So it's like this. There were many eyes trained onto Lionel. But this made sense. If they had to choose a person to display any sort of greed over, it would definitely be him. After all, the legend of Raylion had been firmly implanted into their minds for years already. But Lionel didn't pay them any mind as he turned to Aina. It's good stuff, though it won't be very helpful for now. It's like the puppet master energy. Aina nodded, understanding without Lionel needing to explain further. Force that loosened one's future path as opposed to directly upgrading one's strength was the most sought after. Though Lionel hadn't bothered to ask the dictionary about it. This sort of force was extraordinarily rare. and could only usually be found after killing variant invalids. This fact alone should prove the level of rarity assigned to this force. A force named Life's Breath. It was the rawest and truest form of life elemental force. And the fact that it was appearing in the variant zone of a fifth-dimensional bronze organization just went to show that this place had evolved far beyond what even Valiant Heart knew it to be. Ignoring everyone else, Aina and Lionel walked forward together. Realizing that this hall would likely be an endless road of battle, Aina brought out her battle axe, her light steps making it seem that this Brazinger family heirloom had the weight of a feather when in reality it was likely far heavier than even Lionel's heavy domain spear. Before the group could react to the movement of the couple, they had already taken down the next two guardians, and had already moved on. It feels good, Aina said softly after crushing the orb, and allowing the force to enter her. You can't just casually say that kind of stuff now, Lionel said seriously. Someone might take it the wrong way. Aina turned and gave Lionel a glare, but all she found was a man trying his best to stop his lips from twitching. Aina's current voice was really too seductive. Anything she said could easily be taken out of context. Yet simultaneously, she had a presence no one dared to blaspheme. It was an eerie combination that could drive a man wild. Luckily for Lionel, he didn't mind looting his own girlfriend, even if she did have the presence of an empress. The one thing Lionel would never feel is inferior. He had always pursued Aina with his head held high. If she was an empress, he would be an emperor. Plus, someone had to put a baby in the empress, right? Of course it should be him. At that moment, the others seemed to have recovered, presenting a new problem to the group. With only 2 guardians appearing each time, but there being 12 of them, how exactly would they decide who battled? The logical choice would be that since practically everyone aside from Radleys and Serioth had come in pairs of 2, they should allow a rotation of 6 with each pair getting a shot. But this sort of logical and fair route, would it really be accepted? Lionel had thought of it long ago, but he already knew it would be rejected by Raylion and Hephaestus, so why would he waste his breath? As for majority rule, that only worked on the weak, and those who thought of themselves as weak. And obviously, Raylion and Hephaestus wouldn't think of themselves in this way. As expected, when Lionel and Aina made it to the line of the third pair of guardians, a sharp wind pierced toward their backs. The couple simultaneously each took a step to the side, separating from each other by a measure as an arrow soared between their shoulders and splintered the forehead of a guardian in 2. Lionel sent a casual look back, to find a young man with features he seemed to recognize grabbing an orb out of the air. However, though Lionel recognized his features, he didn't recognize the man himself. Family member? Cousin? Most likely sibling. Balthorn. Lionel's mind completed the circuit in a split moment, and realized that this person must be an elder brother of Balthorn's. And from the looks of it, he was a member of Bear Rose. For some reason, though he was clearly the vice leader, the leader, a petite young woman only tall enough to reach his shoulder, seemed to differ to him. In fact, this Bear Rose leader was among those struggling against the mountain pass pressure. Lionel couldn't help but be intrigued by this dynamic. Chapter 746. Chapter 746. Glass Dome. The arrow that had soared by Lionel and Aina suddenly rose back up and shot back, landing in Balthorn's elder brother's palm as though it had always been there. Telekinesis? No, this is a bit different from that. The control was specifically on the arrow tip. There's no reason for that unless what he can control is limited to metal and metal alone. Thinking back to Balthorn and her control over those massive and heavy steel balls, Lionel came to a realization. It was either that these siblings just so happened to awaken similar abilities, or this was related to the lineage factor of their family. It had to be remembered that the awakening of abilities was completely random. It was a gift given by the universe, and technically gave those with weak backgrounds a chance to rise up. As such, there was no shortage of individuals from powerful families who awoke abilities that were completely useless. In fact, Lionel had fought his fair share of battles where the losing party didn't use their ability even when a loss was imminent. It's clear that in that situation, it wouldn't be a matter of hiding one's trump card, but rather a case where this trump card was useless. The most common abilities were low-level boosts to one's physical attributes like strength or speed or eyesight or maybe hearing. Not all abilities had all the fancy bells and whistles Sail's ability did, and most weren't as useful as Lionel's despite not having a tangible form. From Lionel's deduction, Balthorn was likely born with a useless ability, which was why she didn't use it even when her life was on the line against the Titan hyena. As for her brother, well, his control over their lineage factor was clearly much greater, and had a much greater range. But only time would tell if his ability was useless. Or rather it would if Lionel hadn't already used the dictionary to check everyone's ability, and knew for a fact that his ability was indeed useless. But his sharpened eyesight most definitely helped with his archery. At that moment the second guardian fell. But this one was taken by Raylion, who had still not shattered his first orb. The tension in the group seemed to reach another level. No one seemed eager to allow Lionel and Aina to continue leading the group, but no one wanted to stand too close to each other either. Unfortunately, in such a tense atmosphere, one couldn't possibly expect peace to last for long, and that it didn't. It didn't even take much time at all. When the group reached the fourth pair of guardians, hell erupted. The moment they appeared, the leader of Severed Heart, a man with an expression that seemed carved out of the purest ice cold, took action swiftly, a spear of lightning appearing before him and tearing a path toward the guardian. However, at that same instant, Sail seemed to want to make a move as well. Her wrist manifested several swirling petals. But instead of becoming her melee weapons like last time, she seemed to have evolved them to become capable projectiles. The path of the lightning spear and seemingly dainty petals crashed, resulting in an explosion that ended up not injuring even a hair on the guardians. At that same instant, Balthorn's elder brother moved again, but his action was impeded by Hephaestus, who also seemed to want in. But Hephaestus didn't have any long-ranged attacks, so he directly deflected the Bear Rose Vice leader's arrows before grabbing it out of the air. Clearly not willing to let such a thing slide, Balthorn's brother let loose a rain of arrows, not giving Hephaestus a chance in the slightest. In an instant, though only 4 were fighting, it essentially placed 8 in a deadlock. Though the petite girl by Balthorn's brother hadn't moved yet, one would think that she wasn't as simple as she looked, especially since Raylion had yet to take action. At the same time, Severed Heart's vice leader was glaring daggers at Sail's companion, seemingly only waiting for an opportunity to tear him to shreds. Lionel watched all of this with a helpless expression while Seriath and Radleys didn't seem amped to take action. Seeing Lionel's gaze from across the sparking lights of the battlefield, Radleys put 2 thumbs up, raising them to the sides of his pale face as he looked from Aina to Lionel and back again. Even though Aina was masked, he still couldn't help but click his tongue. This woman was truly too pristine. Lionel was left speechless by this. Radleys once again, if it was anyone else ogling Aina like this, had probably sent a few arrows their way. But this Radleys always seemed to be covered in a thin layer of fog. Lionel couldn't tell if he was serious or not. Up to this point, none of Radleys' actions seemed to add up. Lionel shook his head and chose to calmly observe the battle. Considering how long this corridor was, he was under no illusions that this would end anytime soon. They might spend weeks, even months in this place. If they had to fight it out like this every time, it would take even longer. So Lionel was under no illusions that he had to save everyone. These people were aware of the dangers and they were still fighting. He wasn't their babysitter. If some got eliminated early here, it would be better for the atmosphere of the group. The best he could do for them was if one was close to dying, he would just throw them into a snow globe to give them a chance. That was the best his kindness could give them right now. Lionel's eyes began to wander. Even though his senses remained trained on the battlefield in case anything untoward could happen, he found that this hall was far more fascinating than he gave it credit for. Lionel's pupils suddenly constricted. The glass dome above them had originally been flooded with sunlight. But, the moment the hall went dark, only illuminating a small light around the bronze statues, the sunlight had also disappeared. But now, with the sun gone, Lionel was suddenly able to see subtle patterns that the bright lights had obscured before. Those patterns? Lionel flipped over a palm, bringing out a familiar ring. But what he hadn't expected was that the moment he did, he vanished, leaving just 11 youths behind. Chapter 747. Chapter 747. What the? Aina's eyes widened. Her hand subconsciously reached out to grab at Lionel, but by the time she had reacted and moved, her palm could only touch at empty air. Her brows creased beneath her mask, confusion coloring her face. There was nothing that Lionel kept from Aina. On the days they spent together, they meandered through conversation that usually lasted hours at a time. It could be said that the only thing Lionel had never told Aina were the words his coach had spoken on that day. This was all to say that Aina had long since been aware of the existence of the ring, and had just seen Lionel pull it out while no one was paying attention. Knowing this, though still worried about Lionel's safety, it wasn't to the point that Aina was plunged into a well of despair. After she took a deep breath, practically hypnotizing herself into believing that Lionel would be fine, she looked up, her eyes several shades colder than they were just a moment ago. If she had to face the 10 who remained alone, and without a partner, that was fine too. In her heart, though, she couldn't shed a last stubborn and sinking feeling. However, this just filled her with the will to vent, and she definitely wouldn't be as merciful as Lionel. As Aina was panicking, one could only imagine what Lionel was feeling. Fuck! Send me back. Lionel's roar bellowed into a wide expanse of sky. Worry for himself? He never felt it. But the idea of leaving Aina behind in that cesspool of human angst and ambition made his heart feel as though it was being lit on fire. General. Lionel's head snapped in the direction of the voice only to realize that he was seated on a steed in the middle of a 1,000-strong army. His roar that shook the skies seemed to have awakened them all. However, the words Lionel spoke make the dreary atmosphere even worse. Even the general knew that this was a losing battle. Why should they even bother to fight? Shouldn't they just lay down their arms and give up now? Lionel's rage had yet to dissipate. At first, he really didn't have the mind to care who was calling out to him, or if he was even being called out to at all. He had never thought the simple act of taking out the ring would result in this. To make matters worse, it was now stuck on his finger, and he couldn't even take it off if he wanted. However, Lionel soon realized that he had to calm down. No amount of roaring or rage was going to make this ring magically pop off, nor did this world seem prepared to listen to him. It was only after Lionel reached this infuriating conclusion that he finally decided to look around. The army he stood within was indeed 1,000 strong. However, there wasn't a single unifying identity to them in the slightest. In fact, they looked like nothing more than a group of ruffians. If they were holding hoes and plows, Lionel could easily mistake them for farmers rather than the warriors they were supposed to be. Beyond that, the horses they rode, if they could be called that at all, looked as though they had been starved for several weeks. They had discolored patches of skin. Their ribs were visible through their dull coats, and their legs seemed several measures too thin. Was this supposed to be a cavalry? Weren't they better off on foot? Lionel had hardly finished this thought when his internal sight swept over the men once more. It was only then that he realized that beneath their cobbled-together armor was sunken skin, malnutrition, and a vulnerability so keen they could hardly withstand the heft of their own weapons. What the hell is this? General? Lionel looked over to the source of the voice, only to find out that this person was indeed talking to him. He seemed to be a young man, no older than Lionel himself. He had a nervous look hidden within his blue eyes, but his hands gripped at his sword so hard his veins threatened to burst. Lionel could see an almost pleading look in the eyes of this young man. Whereas the others only had fear, this young man had a small bit of hope. Gazing around once more, Lionel realized that of the army, only this young man stood almost level to him. Though he was a half-step back as a sign of respect, he was nearly shoulder to shoulder with Lionel. Right-hand man? Lieutenant maybe? Lionel's brows furrowed. Before he could truly understand, a rumbling began to sound in the distance. Though they were several kilometers away, they still seemed capable of making the ground quake. Their presence alone plunged Lionel's army into a deeper bout of despair. Though they were so far away, with the improvement of his internal sight, Lionel could easily see them. What he saw, though, made him sigh. Compared to their army, this one was leagues above. Though they didn't have high-class and shimmering armor, their weapons were well kept, their steeds were well fed, and their bodies bolstered a strong health that rippled through their muscles. As though that wasn't enough, their numbers were double their own. I need to get out of this place as quickly as possible. At that moment, Lionel's spear appeared with a flip of his palm as he jumped down from his horse. This sort of steed would only hinder him, not to mention the fact he hated riding horses. Did you hear me? Lionel's sudden roar shook the warriors to his back again. If this is the kind of heart you want to show, that kind of spineless, cowering, effeminate garbage, just send me back. I want no part of it. But if you want to be men, if you want to defend your lands and protect your women and children, then raise your weapons. Lionel's roar echoed through the valley. On either side of them, tall walls of rock stood. There wasn't a single place to go but forwards or backwards. However, backward is where their homes lay. It was where those they loved and cherished rested. Going backwards was not an option. The gaze of the blue-eyed youth shimmered. Forward! Lionel roared, charging ahead, his body wrapped in golden light. If one looked upon the valley from above, it would feel as though one was watching a blazing laser of gold tear a path forward. It felt as though Lionel could cross hundreds of meters in the blink of an eye. His speed was undeniable, but his momentum was even higher. What are you all waiting for? Charge! The blue-eyed youth rose his weapon into the air, pointing it forward and kicking the side of his horse. The army surged forward like a tide. They had poor coordination and their formation was faulty, but at the very least, a fire burned in their eyes. Lionel's back was like a fuel that lit their bellies. As for Lionel himself, though, he was inwardly shaking his head, wondering how he had gotten himself into this mess. As amped up as the soldiers following behind Lionel were, he himself just wanted to end this battle as quickly as possible, hoping that this would send him out. Unfortunately, no matter how powerful Lionel felt that he was now, he really wasn't confident in taking down 2,000 warriors at the same time, especially since they were all in the fourth dimension. The only reason Lionel shot ahead on his own like this wasn't because he could do it alone. It was because he was the only one strong enough to disrupt this army's formation before they reached his men. If he didn't, this well-trained army would run through his like a knife through butter. Lionel shook his head. Is this another zone? Why would it teleport me here? What the hell does it have to do with the ring? Lionel really couldn't fathom just what was happening. However, he had also never been in a zone that could be continuously reopened for the sake of training future generations. That said, the zone should still fundamentally follow its original purpose, right? A variant zone was supposed to be a zone that allowed those who entered to benefit from things in the future. It appeared when a world was on the brink of collapse in order to give it a chance. Plus, this time, rather than coming in as himself, Lionel seemed to have been loaded in as some sort of pre-designed character. This wasn't how it had been before at all. However, what did this have to do with that ring? And what was maybe even more mind-boggling was how Senior Lou got his hands on this ring to begin with. Lionel had to be very cautious with investigating Senior Lou's background. After all, why would he be making such inquiries if there wasn't anything suspicious going on? But he hadn't been able to catch anyone snooping around after his disappearance. That made Lionel conclude just one thing. Maybe Senior Lou really had only stumbled into some luck, only to end up benefiting Lionel in the end? But was this even a benefit? Lionel didn't even want to be here. Damn it. Scan this place. How the hell do I get out of here? By now, Lionel was just a kilometer from the charging army, his annoyance becoming more and more palpable. Ping. Subdimensional zone detected. Valiant Heart. Subdimensional zone grade. Quasi-silver. Clear requirements. Valiant Heart. Side quest. Valiant Heart. Side quest. Valiant Heart. Hidden quest. Valiant Heart. Ping. Seed is warned to be wary of Valiant Heart. Lionel almost tripped over and fell. What the fuck was this? Chapter 748. Chapter 748. Sorrow. Lionel didn't have time to make sense of what he was hearing. He subconsciously felt that even if he had all the time in the world, it still wouldn't matter. Somewhere deep inside, he subconsciously felt that his father was playing another practical joke on him. But how could his dad possibly know that he would stumble into such a ring and be teleported to this place? Senior Lu was too insignificant of a character to be predicted by anyone, and maybe this was simply what some called fate. Practical joke or not, though, all Lionel knew was that the dictionary had lost its usefulness in this situation. He could only hope that he could finish things quickly, or that the time dilation here bordered on excessive. He couldn't afford to be here for as long as he had been in the Camelot zone. Lionel's figure flickered, his 4-meter-long wind spear following in a stream behind his strike. The opposing army seemed stunned that a single man had led the charge all on his own. And in fact, Lionel's supposed right-hand man was also beginning to panic. Though he had wanted Lionel to be fired up and lead the army well, this was a bit too much, no? However, it was already too late to call him back. The blue-eyed youth hesitated. Trying to call Lionel back now would dampen the momentum of the army by a considerable bit. But at the same time, wouldn't Lionel's death be even worse? Gritting his teeth, the lieutenant made a decision. However, just as he opened his mouth to speak, the situation abruptly changed once again. Illusory wings spread to Lionel's back. As though the golden image of a heavenly rock, his speed increased explosively. In one instant, he was still 100 kilometers from the opposing army. In the next, he had appeared above their general, his spear jetting out like a meteor. The opposing general couldn't even react before a spear had split through his brows. The battlefield fell into silence for just a moment. But that was quickly ended by an explosion of fire that lit the air aflame. The opposing general's head combusted until all that was left was ash. Lionel landed on the general's still-running steed, his steps unexpectedly light. His motion to kick the opposing general off before landing was so seamless that the horse didn't even seem to realize that its owner had already been slaughtered. Lionel raised his head up to the sky and roared, billowing flames jetting out from his mouth as though to signal his victory. His army was stunned for a moment before they erupted. Their blood boiling to the absolute limit, they saw nothing but red. Their own roars echoed through the valley, their charge suddenly gaining organization and purpose. It was then that a slaughter was released. The battle ended not even an hour later. With Lionel leading the charge and taking on much of the pressure, they managed to survive. However, there was only so far motivation could get an army. Despite the victory, Lionel lost at least 50% of his men, leaving barely 500 remaining. And though he expected the result to be like this, he was still very much in this world with no sign of getting out. Sighing deeply, Lionel shook his head. Gather the scattered horses, don't let them run far. Those that are able-bodied will become our new war horses. Those that are too injured to be of use will be slaughtered and used for food. Other than this, take spoils as you please. This army was clearly lacking in food and equipment. Though this was a hard-fought battle and they had lost many, it ironically guaranteed that everyone would gain a large upgrade in this regard. Using the carriages the opposing army had brought along, they began to organize their loot. However, this was undertaken only after they dealt with their dead, giving each man a proper burial. Even though Lionel wanted to leave this place as quickly as possible, he couldn't help but feel the weight of these deaths. Ever since he had entered the Mayan zone, Lionel had never been able to separate the lives from a zone to those in real life. To him, whether the past, future or present, these were all people. He couldn't help but feel that maybe he had been too rash. Maybe he should have thought of a different plan, a different approach that would have ended in more surviving. Logic told him that with the army already in the valley and the enemies charging forth, there was no other course of action to be taken. But emotions seemed to rage through his heart. He was supposedly intelligent, right? Why hadn't he even tried to think of anything else? And the truth was that he knew the answer to this. He knew exactly why he threw the lives of these men away, without caring to look for another way. It was Aina. He was so worried about his own loved one that he neglected to care about the fact that these men had their own girlfriends, their own wives, their own children and mothers and fathers, friends and grandparents, dreams and aspirations. Lionel clenched his fists, his jaw steeling. When they all finally returned to the small town they all called home, it hit Lionel like a ton of bricks. Walls of women and children stood anxiously at the gates. They flooded the outer town limits, many of them camping and even more staying completely awake, unable to sleep until they laid eyes on their lovers, their husbands, their fathers. When they saw the army return in victory, a cheer that shook the town resounded. The walls quaked and the ground trembled. However, when the number they expected to return was reduced by half, the wails and cries were just as resounding. This sweeping sorrow, flooding the town like a monsoon, crashed through Lionel's heart in waves. Chapter 749. Chapter 749. Small home. The men and women of this town had all been prepared to die. The threat they faced was too great, and they were simply too weak. They knew that they should be happy simply for the sake of surviving. They should be grateful, thanking their lucky stars that they could see another day. However, how could pain be washed away by logic? General. The blue-eyed youth always stood silently by Lionel's side. Seeing him blankly staring at the pain and grief before him, he couldn't help but check up on him. Lionel absent-mindedly responded, his gaze never shifting. There was a little girl over there, no more than 7 years old, clutching the blood-stained scabbard her father had left home with. Not far from her, there was a woman. She had a young and youthful face. Though she wasn't extraordinarily beautiful, she was very pretty, maybe even the prettiest within this small, malnourished town. Yet, tears streamed down her face endlessly, her sobs echoing as she grasped onto a necklace that hung from her neck with both hands. With every quiver her body made in her fit of sorrow, her dress shifted in the wind, making the baby bump she sported all the more obvious. On another side, there was an elderly couple. The old woman with deep gray hair trembled in her husband's arms, her tears getting lost in the folds of her wrinkles. The eyes of the two were already murky with age, but they clutched their son's leather armor between the two of them, their fragile bodies seemingly ready to be blown over by the wind. Lionel's senses were too sharp. He didn't miss a single story of grief, a single cry of pain, not a single tear, not a single quiver. It was all seared into his mind and stored in a place he would never forget, leaving a mark he could never ignore. The blue-eyed youth sighed again. The pain they experienced would have been far worse if not for you, General. Lionel didn't respond. Was that the metric he should be using? Especially when just hours ago, he didn't even spare the lives and deaths of these people a single thought. Once again, logic seemed to tell him one matter, while his heart pulled him toward another. Lionel wanted to roar into the skies, but he knew that even if he did, he wouldn't be able to vent his rage in the slightest. Suddenly, Lionel felt a tight grip on his wrist. He looked down to find that his blue-eyed, right-hand man had grabbed onto him. Come on, General. I can't let you wallow away in another bar all night after saving our asses. I'll take you to meet my girl. You haven't met her yet, right? The blue-eyed youth beamed. Lionel forced a smile, and allowed himself to be pulled along. He didn't know what he should be doing in this world, but he knew that wallowing in self-pity wasn't it. Plus, the youth continued, our esteemed general can't be the only one without a proper home to be greeted by, right? How embarrassing would that be? The blue-eyed youth's laughter seemed to want to fill Lionel's soul with light and hope. The two entered the town, traveling through its streets. Lionel noticed the shabby roads, the half-broken homes, the filth and the poverty. It seemed that whether they camped out at the town's entrance or not, the living conditions of these people truly wasn't that much better. In fact, they might have been better off living in nature. However, what Lionel did notice was a large building at the center of the town. Compared to everywhere else, it was almost like a heaven, unblemished by the trash of this world. He couldn't help but wonder just what it was. Soon though, the blue-eyed youth led Lionel to a modest little home of stone and wood. It's nothing much, but I managed to secure it with our military salary. That sum you lent me? This is what it went into. The two entered the small home, only to hear a sudden cry. Rollin! A blur of blue leapt into the blue-eyed youth's arms. When this blur cleared, it became obvious that it was a petite youth lady who was about the same age as the two leaders of the town's army. Seeing her, Lionel realized that there was a hidden flower of this town. It seemed that Rollin was quite a lucky man. At the same time, Lionel felt relieved to finally know this young man's name. With how familiar they apparently were with one another, it would have been too embarrassing if Lionel had to ask. Elise, come. Rollin beamed. This is our general and my very best friend. Lionel smiled in greeting. Ah, my manners. Elise politely curtsied. her dress spreading outward that a blooming flower. I was just getting preparations for dinner finished. In just about half an hour, everything should be finished. There's more than enough for a +1. With those words done, as though a little bundle of energy, Elise skipped off to the kitchen under Roland's delighted laughter. Lionel suddenly felt a great peace observing this small home. Though he still felt like a third-party observer to this world, he couldn't help but think of how nice it would be if he and Aina could have such a life. If she never had to go through such trauma as a child, if she never lost her mother, if her father never disappeared, would they be able to be together like this? In a home they called their own, cooking side by side, laughing and joking with one another without a care in the world? He truly wanted this. But he also knew how important revenge for her mother was to Aina. He knew that it gripped her and consumed her every waking moment. Maybe such a peaceful life they were never destined for. An hour later, as the trio was exchanging banter over a warm dinner, a heavy, almost obnoxious knocking came from the door. What was more shocking, though, was that this person didn't wait for the door to be answered. Rather, it was very soon broken from its hinges. Chapter 750. Chapter 750. Yes, the house was very small to begin with. It only had a single room, a single bathroom, and the dining room, living space and kitchen could all be considered to be one cobbled-together homogeneous zone. This was all to say that the trio had a very clear line of sight to the door, and it was even more to say that it wouldn't have taken any of them more than 5 seconds to reach and open it. Could there really be anything so important that it couldn't wait 5 seconds? Lionel frowned. The moment the door crashed down, a large figure stomped in. No, maybe it was more accurate to say that this person looked quite large because of the heavy and somewhat flowery armor they wore. Though their massive belly wasn't helping. Lionel had seen his fair share of warriors to this point, and there were some who could have large bellies and still be explosive athletes and powerful soldiers. Lionel's own teammates were among them. His offensive linemen were essentially his bodyguards, and in terms of strength, at least before the metamorphosis, Lionel couldn't match up to a half of them. However, Lionel could immediately tell that this person was most definitely not a warrior of any kind. The armor they wore seemed to be lined with force arts that gave his frail body the capability to move around, and even exhibit the strength he just had to break down the door. This alone made it impressive. But this alone didn't make this person worthy of fear. And yet, the instant this individual appeared, Roland and Elise shot up from their seats, saluting seriously. Even after several moments, they didn't dare to raise their heads. The fat, armored maid scanned the small home with a clear disdain painting across the narrowed slits of his eyes. From the beginning, he didn't even care to check that everyone was showing him his due respect. After all, he already expected it. Was there even a need to question? His lordship Helles has demanded the presence of the general. He questions why it is that an hour has passed since your return, yet there has still been no formal report sent to his lordship's manor? It was only after speaking out words that seemed squeezed from the mouth of a weasel that the fat, armored man turned to the dining room table. At first, he nodded in satisfaction when he saw that Roland and Elise still had their heads lowered in a deep bow. But his face froze when he realized the Lionel was still sitting at his seat, his gaze scanning him up and down as though observing something inconsequential. At that moment Lionel stood. It seems that I will have to come back a later time. Thank you for your hospitality. The fat, armored man trembled with rage. But when Lionel took a step toward him, he suddenly felt like a towering giant. Roland's expression changed. Though his head was still lowered, he had known Lionel all his life. That tone of his voice made it obvious that he was angry. He wouldn't go and do something foolish, right? Roland's expression changed. He wanted to call out, but if he did so, he might turn whatever wrath would be aimed toward Lionel, toward him and his wife as well. Roland hesitated. However, in the end he gritted his teeth. Raising his head before he received an okay from the fat, armored man, he stepped forward and grabbed Lionel's arm seriously. Lionel was stunned. When he looked back and into Roland's eyes, he couldn't help but shiver. That look. He hadn't seen it in a long time. It was different from the reliance and trust Lionel had experienced that day after he saved the freshman. No, It was a look of willingness to walk through the fires of hell together, a look Lionel had only seen from the few brothers he trusted the most in this life. "Don't," Roland said firmly. Lionel stayed silent for a long while. It was at the moment Roland thought that he had gotten through to him that Lionel suddenly lashed out, punching Roland squarely in the jaw and sending him sprawling to the floor. Elise's small shriek sounded as she watched her husband tumble to the ground. Lionel fixed his sleeve as though washing Roland's dirty hands away, and walked up to the fat, armored brute. "Hurry up," Lionel barked. "You." Before the fat man could say anything more, Lionel was already standing less than a step from him. It felt at that moment that thought Lionel was only a head taller. He might as well have been 10. It was like a mountain was weighing down on him from above. Fearing for his life, the fat man could only turn back, a sinister light flashing in his eyes. It was almost as though he could already see the image of Lionel's demise. It wasn't long before the small home fell into an eerie quiet. Elise scrambled to her husband's side, tears falling uncontrollably down her delicate cheeks. Why did he do this? Elise entered a state of half-hysteria. The mixture of fear and seeing her love hurt like this left her not knowing how to react or feel. Elise was quite a naive and pure young woman. She didn't seem to understand the danger of war, or she at least chose to be relentlessly optimistic about it. Why else would she be waiting with dinner prepared for Roland, while practically everyone else felt that the town was finished? Yet, because Roland told her his best friend, the general, would most definitely succeed, she believed his word and even began to almost deify Lionel as well. But now Roland sighed deeply, wiping the blood from his lip. "Don't blame him. He did this for our sake." A flash of determination lit Roland's gaze. He reached out and grabbed his wife's hand. "Elise, are you willing to be with me in life and in death?" Elise froze when she heard these words, but soon her tears came spilling forward even faster than before. She buried herself in her husband's arms, but her words were surprisingly clear and firm. "Yes." Chapter 751. Chapter 751. Lionel wasn't very surprised when he was led to the manor he saw in the distance previously. However, he still couldn't help but watch as the streets became cleaner, more well-paved, better kept. It was as though he was slowly traveling into a new world. Step by step, the houses grew larger, more elaborate. Guards began to show their presence more and more often. The number of luxuries seemed to skyrocket with every street he passed by. The most common marker of this wealth was weight. Overweight women and men seemed to be everywhere, chatting idly, drinking things the poor could never get and spitting out food the poor could never taste. Then there was the holy grail of them all. The manor was 4 stories tall, and just its front face was 50 meters long from end to end. At its doors, true guards stood, wearing the same armor as the fat man by Lionel's side. Except these guards were actually powerful enough that Lionel's patience fell by another measure the more of them he saw. Where were these strong warriors when they fought that battle? Where had this equipment and armor they wore been? It can't be that they stood here this entire time to protect a manor that was dozens of miles from the battlefield. Right? His lordship has requested the general's presence. The fat man spoke to the guards, seemingly recognizing this man's identity. Even some of the guards gave him looks of disdain. But toward these kind of people, Lionel didn't particularly care if they sided with him or not. Ultimately, were they not here while men much weaker than them, far less trained, and far less fed fought in their stead? Who were they to feel disdain toward anybody? Lionel's emotions fluctuated slightly. The moment his foot reached the top step, the marble cracked and splintered. But he continued walking as though nothing had happened, passing by the guards without a greeting. Long after his back had disappeared into the manor, the fat, armored man forgetting to follow. The cold sweat that covered the backs of the guards could practically form a pool. The inside of the manor was as luxurious as one might expect. But each and every item Lionel laid eyes on caused his mind to flash to another undernourished soldier. Another poor steed they were forced to ride. Another blunt sword they were forced to swing. Another weeping family member that was forced to grieve. Lionel didn't need anyone to guide him. With his internal sight, the entire layout of the manor had already been reflected in his mind. With large strides, he pushed open 2 large wooden double doors to be greeted by an elaborate feast. If there was ever an incarnation of gluttony, Lionel felt that he had found it. Just for the sake of feeding what amounted to just 8 people, there were numerous large bird and beasts, endless piles of fruit, 2 cakes that were at least a meter tall each, pitchers of juice that could all fill their own table. The spread was practically endless, each dish having an assigned servant of their own. Lionel could tell at a glance by the speed and pace these 8 men and women ate their food with that it would be impossible for them to finish it all. Of the food they tasted, large amounts of meat remained on the bone. Sandwiches lay with a bite or 2 taken out of them. Juice cups were swapped between with the nourishing fluids within having been forgotten. Every detail Lionel laid his eyes on made his expression calmer and calmer. Eventually, he became so placid that he didn't even seem to exist anymore. As a result, no one seemed to notice he was here for several long seconds, allowing him the time he needed to thoroughly imprint everything he saw into his memory. "Ah, General, I'm quite disappointed." One of the 8 men began to speak, a half-finished chicken leg still being worked on by him. "Though you won this battle, I am not a very patient man. Not only was there no report of spoils given to me, my own general didn't appear, and made we wait over an hour before I was forced to send an attendee to retrieve him. What do you think a lord like me is to do with such disobedient subordinates?" Lionel didn't respond as he stood at the doorway. The lord looked up from his food to see Lionel wasn't even looking at him. Rather, Lionel was looking up at a crest that hung from the wall. It was quite beautiful, truly. At the forefront, there was a silver shield with the image of a roaring lion etched onto it. To its back, there were 2 spears crossed, exuding a valiant aura of dominance. Across the bottom, a fluttering ribbon of words written in an odd, ancient language with rune-like lettering could be found. Yet Lionel somehow understood what it said perfectly. The valiance of a warrior. The heart of a protector. The words seemed to resonate with Lionel. But he only felt more and more disgusted when he realized it was painted onto the wall of a person who couldn't understand its meaning. Or maybe he did understand it, and simply didn't care. "Boy, did you not hear the words of his lordship? Have you nothing to?" The shrill voice of an obese woman was cut short by Lionel's spear in her throat. The sound of a struggling gurgle brought the place to a halting silence before the screams of the attendees suddenly sounded through the hall. The guards manning the walls suddenly sprung into action, leaping for Lionel. But they were dispatched with just as much ease, the last gaze they had of the world being those sharp, cold eyes. Lionel killed the gluttons one by one. In what felt like just a few seconds, he stood before the Lord. Grabbing his fat neck, Lionel raised him up from his seat. Foul smells began to waft off of the Lord. One part came from his poor hygiene, but the others definitely came from him soiling himself. "Why, you can't kill me. I was appointed by His Majesty himself." Ack. Lionel's spear shot through his heart. He watched on coldly as the Lord slowly bled out, his gaze becoming more chilling with each passing moment. Chapter 752. Chapter 752 Silence. Lionel watched as the corpses fell before him. The screams of the attendees and the subsequent commotion of the manor all shook the city, yet he didn't seem to be able to hear anything. He stared at Lord Helly's body as it slowly bled out before him. Even now, the man struggled to gasp and gurgle, his gradually dimming eyes still filled with shock. Even as he died, he couldn't fathom the idea of someone killing him. He couldn't wrap his head around how someone beneath him, someone he had appointed, no less, could possibly treat him in this way. When Helly's took his last struggling breath, Lionel turned and walked out of the dining room, his gaze still suffused with coldness. Walking down the hallways, there were some guards who simply charged by him despite the fact he still wielded a bloody spear. Maybe in their minds, they still couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of someone attacking their lord either. So, when they heard such commotion and alarm, their first reaction was to understand the situation before taking action. As for the few guards with sense enough to realize that these matters were definitely related to Lionel, they received a whipping spear to the side of their heads, causing their brains to rattle within their skulls. The commotion of the city continued to grow. However, It soon became obvious to Lionel that not all of it was caused by himself. There was most definitely something else going on. But even Lionel was shocked when he stepped out of the manor doors to find the source. At that moment, Lionel stood at the top of the manor's marbled steps, his position unwittingly being right above the cracks his own feet had caused earlier. Down below, there was an accumulating surge. One would have thought that this was the result the movements of the Majesty Hellies mentioned before his death. But Lionel knew that such a thing was far too quick. He had no idea who this Majesty was, but what he did know was that they couldn't possibly be so close by and things couldn't possibly be so coincidental. When the surge got closer, though, even Lionel couldn't help but be stunned. He was correct. It really wasn't this so-called Majesty, but the source was potentially even more shocking. A hodgepodge of men and women, even some Lionel would deem as children, all pushed through and into the noble district. Without a care for the risk to their lives, they clashed against the patrolling guards, their rage palpable. Compared to the shimmering armor of the guards they faced, their equipment was shabby. Many of them ran along with their bare feet, unable to afford shoes. Most wore rags that could barely cover their bodies. Some gripped makeshift weapons or kitchen knives so awkwardly that it became clear they had never done such a thing in their lives before. At the helm of this army was a young man Lionel recognized all too well. Even from so far away, Lionel could see the fury and determination that lit his eyes. But what was maybe even more heart-stopping was the fact his petite little wife followed right by his side. She too wielded nothing but a kitchen knife, probably due to the fact any other weapon would have been too heavy for her. Her face was the picture of nervousness crossed with resolve, but the tears that simultaneously fell from her cheeks made Lionel's coldness dissipate somewhat, an involuntary chuckle escaping his lips. This wasn't because he was laughing at Elise's weakness. Rather, he felt as though he was watching his little sister try her best to open a jar with her tiny hands. She squeezed and grunted, putting in all the effort her small body allowed. However, it only resulted in sniveling tears that made one want to protect her with all their heart. The resolve for such a woman to enter a battlefield like this one was beyond Lionel's range of understanding. He didn't even know if he himself had such resolve. But what he knew for certain was that if he was Rollin, he most definitely wouldn't have the resolve that would be needed to march into enemy territory with his wife by his side like this, knowing that he couldn't possibly guarantee his ability to protect her. Was Rollin wrong for doing this? Lionel felt that the answer was too complicated. He had no idea. On the one hand, one had a duty as a husband, to protect one's wife, one's children, one's family. In a lot of ways, keeping them out of danger in the first place was part of this responsibility. But on another, Rollin had a duty to himself, to continue to be that man his wife fell in love with, that man of pride and honor, of sacrifice and valiance. If he hid his family away and ignored all of this, could he have continued to do that? And then there was a third perspective. Didn't one also have the duty to bring about the best life one could for one's family? If the world you experienced every day could be considered to be nothing but a living hell, a place where endless suffering was abound and every minute your family spent within it was more heartache than anything else, what would you do? Would you still have to protect the status quo? Would you still be doing your duty as a husband, a father, if you allowed your family to continue to exist in such a world? Where was the line? Which duty should you be most loyal to? Was safety the most important? Were your ideals the most important? Or was happiness the most important? As Rollin continued to lead the charge, his every step was like a hammer on Lionel's heart. When the flood of makeshift warriors finally made it to the manor, they all looked up toward Lionel, who hadn't moved an inch, and Lionel looked back toward them. A silence hung over them all. Even though the city still seemed to be alight with blaring alarms and screaming nobles, it still seemed quiet to them, for some reason. Chapter 753. Chapter 753. 3 months feeling their gazes was more than just that. It wasn't like what one would experience standing before a crowd and being expected to give a well-thought-out speech. No, it was far heavier than that. As though the burden of their hopes and dreams had suddenly been settled onto his shoulders. As though he was their light bearer. As though he was their only hope. It was a different kind of weight, one that would definitely crush the heart and soul of any man unworthy of it all. Roland stood down below, holding on to the small, trembling hand of his wife. His blue eyes seemed to pierce through the space between them, landing on Lionel with a burning light, an endless fervor. He looked from Lionel's face to the bloodied, 4-meter-long spear in his hand. The crimson liquid dripped slowly from its tip, rebounding off of the marbled steps. The sound, slow and rhythmic, beat along with their hearts. "This is your choice?" Lionel asked. In return, silence was all he received. "All right then." The crowd of commoners erupted, their roars and cheers surging through the small town like a torrential wave. For the first time, the nobles began to feel some fear of their own, none of them daring to so much as peek out from their windows. Over a month later, in a distant city that dwarfed the small town in size and stature, a man with a graying beard sat upon a throne, listening to a report expressionlessly. Though his beard was indeed graying, rather than giving him the look of an old, out of his prime man, it instead gave him an air of wisdom and confidence, even bolstering his looks to a level that could only be matched by other refined middle-aged men. "Your Majesty, Heli's death has been confirmed. According to reports, he lost his life at the hands of his general. Since then, the town has been gathered beneath the rulership of the general, and has even begun to rapidly expand. Rather than continuing to defend the border as they're meant to, they've turned their weapons toward the capital, and have been steadily eating away at our territory. At this point, 7 towns and 2 cities have already fallen." The king listened to this matter without much of a change in expression. However, the court ministers around him already began to bluster and rage before he himself got the chance to say anything. Bang! A man with a round belly smashed his fists down on an expensive wood railing. However, considering his stature and power, Lionel wouldn't conclude that he was useless in combat like he had for the other nobles. In fact, this man was definitely quite dangerous, carrying with him strength that could rock the earth. So much noble blood is on his hands. This scourge must be eradicated. Then why don't you go lead an army to stop him? Let him see what the esteemed Michael the Round can do? Michael shot a look of fury over. His title was Michael the Sturdy, not Round. It was clear that someone was trying to humiliate him. When he looked over and saw who it was, his fury only compounded. "You sure have a lot to say, Normand the Cuckold. How about you come over here and do it to my face?" Normand was of much smaller stature than Michael. Despite the fact he was in the king's presence, he had reclined back in his chair, his feet laying up on a similar wooden railing to the one Michael slammed. The only difference was that the two were on completely opposite sides of the royal court. Normand had long, flowing blonde hair and shimmering green eyes. Everything from the shape of his jaw to the outline of his nose could be considered to be at the peak of perfection. He was truly a handsome man amongst handsome men. Even though he was slouched and his figure wasn't clear, one had no doubt that he would match up in this aspect as well. Despite being insulted even more blatantly than Michael had been, Normand didn't react in nearly as enraged a fashion. In fact, he laughed as though the insult wasn't about him at all. Those who knew the story behind this could only show a range of reactions. Some shook their heads, some ignored the situation entirely, but the majority snickered. It was clear that amongst nobles, Normand wasn't well liked at all. And his next words proved exactly why that was. "Ah yes, my wife-to-be was indeed snatched away by His Majesty at the behest of his favorite son. What can I say? I simply did my duty. It's very amusing, even I laugh. I don't mind if you do. But, you know what I find even funnier? If any one of those nobles you're crying and moping about right now were here, would you even let them lick the dirt off the sole of your boots? Do you even really care about them? To you mighty dukes and marquises, what are barons and earls worth? You only care because someone even lower than them is doing the slaughtering. It can't be that you're all unaware of the atrocities they've all committed at the border, right? Having such nobles defend such important and volatile parts of the land was a mistake to begin with. But you never cared then, so why do you care now? A failure all around, in my opinion." Normand yawned. In just about a minute, he had said more than enough to warrant public execution 10 times over. He mentioned a taboo subject he wasn't meant to. He insulted the sovereignty of the nobles, and as such the Majesty, who bestowed them this title. And finally, he insulted His Majesty directly by calling his rulership and policies a failure. Why this man was still alive with such a nonchalant attitude was beyond them. 3 months. The voice came from nowhere. It carried a baritone kind of majesty that couldn't be ignored. Norman didn't bother to move as 2 heavy-set knights picked him up by the arms and began to drag him away. He really seemed too lazy to make any movements. His laughter rang through the courtroom. See you all in 3 months. Chapter 754. Chapter 754. Alexander the Apex's silence fell over the courtroom. No one dared to breathe a word. Even Michael, who should have been gloating, didn't dare to say a thing. In fact, he took a seat, regaining his silence as though nothing had happened. Their king, Alexander the Apex, was a man they all feared from the deepest recesses of their heart. When he spoke, the world listened. When he commanded, the world moved. However, sometimes his inaction was the scariest of all. It had already been 12 years since Norman's fiancée was snatched from him. In these 12 years, Norman had probably only meant maybe a few weeks of them free, if that. In that time, he had never been allowed to die, forced to watch as the love of his life became a tool for another man, and a weapon for a king to exercise his authority. By now, every outburst Norman had was like a plea to have his head lopped off, a hope that one day he would stumble upon a word combination so foul and so pointed that Alexander would finally have enough and put him to death. But each and every time, the king would remain unmoved, passing down a sentence of time without so much as blinking. Then he would continue about his duties as though absolutely nothing had happened. Yet not a single person dared to say a word. It was as though all of them had been watching a session of torture for over a decade. The seed of fear planted within their hearts only seemed to grow with each passing day. A rational fear of their king being etched onto their souls. It took a special kind of sick and twisted person to so nonchalantly do what this king of theirs had done. And none of them dared to be the next. On a whim, their king had destroyed maybe the greatest talent their kingdom had ever seen in Normand, just for the sake of proving a point and asserting his dominance. Then, still not satisfied, he continued to torture this young man who had done absolutely nothing wrong simply so that they would never forget just what he was capable of. This sort of man. You shouldn't ever get on his bad side. Michael. Why yes, Your Majesty. Michael rocketed up to his feet, his belly seemingly made of steel as it didn't bounce even a single time. However, that didn't stop his attempt at keep his arms straight down his side from being laughable. You will lead the expedition. I want this matter handled. Do not bother to come back unless it is. Yes. You're all dismissed. Alexander said emotionlessly. The king stood and left the courtroom, leaving Michael sweating buckets. The truth was that Michael didn't want this assignment. He had stood out for some brownie points, to get some nobles on his side. However, the rumors of the rebel army were too striking to ignore. Of course, it wasn't that he feared Lionel. This was far from the truth. He felt that he could even crush Lionel with ease if that was all there was to it. The issue, though, was that many believed that these things weren't so simple. Before this rebellion began, there were reports of the enemy Oryx tribes making moves. Though they had only sent their human subordinates, it was definitely one of their stronger troops. Yet somehow, this general and a ragtag group of commoners had defeated them? How could this not smell fishy? The consensus was that the Oryx were using this rebel general to sow discord within their kingdom. As such, this rebel army wasn't so simple. They not only had a charismatic leader, but they were receiving support from an enemy even Alexander the Apex could only share land with. This sort of situation was something Michael wanted to stay far out of. Or, at the very least, he wanted to share the burden with numerous nobles, so that he didn't have to take the brunt of the blame. But he just had to open his mouth and call Normand a cuckold. Why did you think Normand was laughing so uproariously? It was because he not only gained another chance to take a dig at the king he hated with all his being, but he knew that he was dragging Michael down with him. The moment the words cuckold left Michael's lips, his fate was sealed. Now he had no choice but to succeed. Michael looked around, but not a single noble dared to look him in the eye. Quite noble indeed. Alexander walked through the castle with a dull expression. He wore fiery red robes and had a single silver shoulder guard over his left shoulder. It gave him the dignified air of a warrior king, although he hadn't been on a battlefield in decades. Alexander pushed open a door. "Royal father." A young man who seemed to be in his mid-20s immediately stood. The location was a small garden that contained a concrete space for sword practice. Considering the drenched state of the young man and the numerous felled sparring partners nearby, filling the air with a bloody scent, it was clear that he had been taking advantage of this training area until his father arrived. In the distance, a young lady sat by a stone fountain, her eyes quite dead. She stared off into space without a word and seemed to show no intention of greeting the king. "Come with me. Bring the girl," Alexander said expressionlessly. Yes. The Prince Rowland didn't hesitate to follow his father's order. Alexander's steps were already far away by the time the words drifted to his ears, but he didn't dally. Without much care or affection, Rowland grabbed the girl's tender arm and pulled her up, dragging her along with him. Seeing that she didn't seem to want to move, he threw her over his shoulder, uncaring that the location he had grabbed her arm at had already begun to bruise. Not long later, Rowland found his father's back waiting by a set of stairs that headed underground. Seeing Rowland's arrival, Alexander began to descend. Chapter 755. Chapter 755. Godhood. Rowland didn't say a word as he followed his father. Even though he had been to this garden almost every day of his life without ever seeing this staircase, he still didn't say anything. He knew his father well. Even as his son, he didn't dare to take a single step out of line. His father spoke when, and only when he wanted to. No question, no words, no insult, could ever budge him from his own pace of doing things. However, the more Rowland saw, the more he found it difficult not to say a word. The underground space was impossibly vast. At first, Rowland thought that it must span at least the whole garden. Then he became certain that it spanned at least the whole castle. But by the end, he wasn't even certain if even the entire royal city was as large as it. There was nothing but a large gray expanse held up by pillars that must have been at least 100 meters tall and 10 meters thick. Just standing by one of them could make one feel like an ant without goal or purpose. And just walking within such a large space made one feel as though you would never reach your destination. Yet though it took several hours, they eventually did. From start to finish, as though to allow his son to soak everything in, Alexander never increased his pace. He took one step after another, his feet perfectly spaced and the cadence of the two of his shoes resonating in perfect, controlled harmony. It was then they reached those doors, those very doors that Rowland would never forget so long as he lived. Compared to the pillars, they weren't very tall, just 10 meters or so. Yet their presence was so much larger that Rowland felt as though he was being suffocated. The doors were the only color in this large expanse of gray. They were cast in a heavy, solid bronze. Even without trying to open them personally, Rowland felt that he would never have the strength needed to open them alone. On its face, ancient runes were drawn across it. The more one stared at it, the more it felt like one's vision was blurring. Rowland lost himself in the runes, suddenly finding himself imagining the start of the world. There was nothing but endless darkness until a hand seemed to reach down from nowhere and began to form things as it pleased. Rowland couldn't even last through the formation of the first star before his brain practically combusted, his nose erupting in a rain of blood that almost made him pass out completely. The only reason he didn't was because he knew what would happen to him if he failed here. His father could always have another son, but he only had this one chance. Swaying, Rowland managed to stay on his feet, his jaw trembling as he grit his teeth. He bit down so hard that a tooth of his cracked in half, almost splintering completely through. But it was this pain that managed to keep him awake. Without a word, nor even a faint acknowledgement, Alexander placed his palms on the doors and pushed hard. At first, all Rowland saw was a blinding light. But what he saw next almost made him drop the girl slinked over his shoulder. His father, the man he respected most in his life, the king who seemed to hold the world in the palm of his hands, dropped to his knees and kowtowed with such fervor that the banging of his forehead against the ground made Rowland feel as though his ears were ringing. Rowland stood frozen. His gaze traveled up and into the room, only to find that within the entire expanse, there was nothing but a singular silver tablet. It sat upon a pedestal, a river of flowing energy hovering around it without a sound. There was nothing present to even acknowledge his father's kowtowing. Moments later, Alexander stood. "Give me the girl." "Ah yes." Rowland passed the young girl over to his father. Despite the fact the both of them stepped into the room, Alexander didn't say anything about his son having to kowtow. Instead, he began to speak of things Rowland didn't know how to accept. In this world, every being is separated by their worth. Alexander placed the girl down on an altar before the silver tablet, stripping all of her clothes off. Yet even to this point, the girl hadn't reacted with even a flinch. It was only at that moment that Rowland understood. He was the only one who was here for the first time. This world that we live in is nothing more than the fifth dimension. However, even then most who live upon it are just of the fourth dimension because even amongst other fifth-dimensional worlds, we are weak. Alexander brought out a blade, cutting into the young girl just above where her womb would be. One would have expected crimson blood to flow out, and that it did. However, there were very clear specks of gold mixed within that caught Rowland completely off guard. These specks of gold poured down the side of her hips and between her legs, pooling around the altar. However, after reaching a certain point, even as blood continued to flow, the pooling blood didn't continue to rise. Clearly, it was being siphoned somewhere. Compared to the fifth dimension, those of the sixth dimension are gods. Compared to the sixth dimension, those of the seventh dimension are deities. Compared to the seventh dimension, those who could step into the eighth were beings beyond comprehension. At that moment, the silver tablet began to glow with a slightly crimson light that slowly grew more golden. To many, this is where the limit of the universe is. Not everything has to end in beautiful, round numbers. The world is often not perfect. After all, there is no real tangible thing as the first dimension. At the very least, it hasn't been properly observed. As for the second dimension, some say that word of mouth and stories can be placed into this category, but even then the consensus is not there. It could be said that the first dimension to truly exist is the third and the last is the eighth. Even the strongest existences in our dimensional verse is of the eighth dimension, and all of them are recluse entities that haven't appeared in countless epochs. An awkward 5 states of beings, 5 steps to ascend to the true apex, to true godhood. But there is still one more. The true overlords of all that there is, the only existences truly worthy of being called God, the creators, or as some would like to call them, the existences of the ninth dimension. Chapter 756. Chapter 756. Rowland could hardly understand the words his father was speaking, but each and every one weighed on his heart like a booming war drum. The ninth dimension? Even to those of the Morales family, it was nothing more than a mythical existence. In fact, even to those of these ever-elusive eighth-dimensional families and organizations, such a level doesn't exist, though many have tried to push past these limits. There was a reason why Earth, despite only having eighth-dimensional potential, is still seen as a hot commodity by the dimensional verse as a whole. To put these matters into perspective, as far as the dimensional verse laymen are concerned, the seventh dimension is the absolute highest. Existences like the Morales family, then, are seen as being the pinnacle. It is only organizations on the Morales family's level, at this ever-elusive seventh dimension, that understand there is at least one more step to take. But to them, whether these eighth-dimensional families and organizations exist is still a mystery. Now one can properly understand just how ridiculous Alexander's words were. He spoke of an existence a step beyond even what the Morales family could prove existed, as though he had personally witnessed it all with his own eyes. Yet, he himself admitted to the fact that he was nothing more than a king of one of the weakest fifth-dimensional worlds in existence. Rowland couldn't think so deeply about these things. He didn't have enough scope of understanding to grasp what his father spoke about. In his mind, this world was the only one and his family was the strongest. But this time it seemed that reality had played a joke on him. Rowland looked down at the girl who was meant to be his wife. She had a wound right above her womb cut open, flowing out with ever-goldening blood. However, she stared at seemingly nothing blankly, her body being almost lifeless. If Rowland couldn't understand by now, he would be too much of a fool. His father hadn't given him Norman's fiancée for the sake of making him happy, nor was it because he had begged and pleaded for it. His father had given him this woman only because it would be more convenient for him to use her like this. What reddish gold blood was flowing out of her at this moment was clearly very important to this tablet. However, none of this explained what this tablet was and what it could do. Rowland opened his mouth to ask, but he hesitated. He really couldn't afford to make a mistake at this critical juncture. There was a reason his father hadn't shown him this, until just now. For some reason, Rowland was certain that if his performance wasn't perfect, he would never walk out of here alive. Cold sweat began to drench Rowland. His skin became tingly and the room's temperature seemed far hotter now than it had been in the past. Without even understanding what he was doing, he kneeled down, smashing his forehead against the ground toward the tablet. His kowtows were even more resounding than his father's, even to the point where blood trickled down and stung his eyes and salted his lips. For the first time since they entered, Alexander looked back. It was just slight, but if one had been looking closely, it seemed as though two slits just beneath his eyes had closed at that exact moment. "Come here." This voice was almost like the call of an angel to Rowland. He realized then that he had finally done the right thing, and managed to traverse this tribulation. Soon father and son stood before a bleeding young woman in the nude. Rowland took a deep breath, suddenly feeling as though his body was invigorated. The bottleneck he had been at for years suddenly shattered, and he stepped into Tier 8 of the fourth dimension. The prince stood frozen in shock. He had only breathed in a small bit of the air this tablet had to offer, but he had broken through so easily? Rowland looked toward his father, but didn't have the words to say. He might look like he was in his mid-20s, but he was way older than this. Even though he trained hard, he still found it difficult to reach this step, something that pissed him off especially when everyone seemed to want to compare him to Normand. Yet this tablet had done exactly that. Rowland's eyes glowed with a fervor even beyond his father's. "Soon, we will be able to call down the gods. The true gods," Alexander said, his voice quivering just the slightest bit. It was imperceptible to most, even his own son. "When that day comes, this world will be ours. But that will only be the very first step. With God's strength, we will claim the dimensional verse for our own." If Lionel had been there, these talks would have sounded eerily familiar to his ear. General, news will have reached the capital by now, and they will definitely be preparing countermeasures. There's a good chance that they may send one of their titled knights. Within a military tent of beast skin, Lionel sat listening to a report given by one of his scouting units. The young man was dressed like an assassin, but also wore goggles over his eyes as he squinted toward a report. Over the past month and a half or so, Lionel had gathered up many subordinates. But it could be said that the ones he trusted with the most tasks were Rowland, and this young orphan everyone called Goggles. "A titled knight, huh?" Lionel smiled. "How powerful are they?" "Powerful. Each and every one is at least Tier 7 with the strongest being Tier 8. But that's not what's important. There are plenty of experts on that level in the kingdom, which is why I keep saying we're all going to die. You know, if everyone just listened to me, we could still turn back right now and trek into a distant mountain somewhere and never return. How would they ever find us? At worst, we could just live off nature for the rest of our lives." All right, Goggles. Get back to the point." He really was a greatly talented young man. Too bad he was afraid of everything. Chapter 757. Chapter 757. Goggles. After being cut off before he could go on yet another emotional tirade, Goggles could only mumble under his breath about building an HR department and how much abuse he was suffering through. Toward this, Lionel could only shake his head while the meeting tent burst into short spurts of hidden chuckles. Titled knight isn't just a randomly handed over title. In other societies, a titled knight is still beneath the lowest noble. Even a baron could easily look down at them. However, to Alexander the Apex, his titled knights represent something completely different. He's able to breathe power to their title, giving them a buff they can use in battle. In addition, beneath the flag of a titled knight, their army gains the same buff, making them extraordinarily powerful. Lionel finally perked up with interest. An ability? He asked. Yes. Alexander the Apex has the ability to breathe power to a word. Due to the fact he is a king, he can also mobilize royal force to fuel his ability and make it far stronger. As such, within the borders of the kingdom, his titled knights are even more powerful. Royal force. Lionel narrowed his eyes. This name was the one used by this world. However, Lionel had already learned about it long ago despite not having heard it referred to with this title. This so-called royal force wasn't royal at all. Or rather, it wasn't exactly related to the kingdom. It was more likely that Alexander had spread this myth, so that he could establish his sovereignty. But the truth was that this royal force was actually world force. World force was a strength one gained access to so long as you wielded at least a quarter of a world spirit. It was similar to universal force in that it gave a strong boost to one's overall techniques. However, there were some differences. For example, world force could be used to directly strengthen one's ability. But universal force couldn't be used so flexibly, especially when it was anchored to one's comprehension of the universal cycles. This said, world force also had its own weaknesses as well. For one, it was capped by the potential of one's world, whereas universal force's only limit was one's comprehension. And second, it became weaker the further from one's world one got. I see. Lionel nodded. Well, here's the plan. Seeing Lionel go from listening to his concerns to listing off their next plan of attack left Goggles feeling like he should find a wall to bang his head against. Was his explanation not clear enough? They should be running. Well, split the army into 4. Well, attack here in exactly 3 weeks. Lionel pointed toward a location on the map. A week later we will attack here. 2 weeks after that here. Lionel continued to point. I will personally head every battle. Don't worry about how I plan on crossing so much distance, just trust me. Once those attacks are completed, the first army will take this route, the second this, the third this, and we'll all meet with the fourth army exactly 2 weeks from now. That day will be when their titled knight falls. Alright, everyone is dismissed. Rollin, you will lead the fourth army. Concealment is your main objective until the second month arrives. Goggles, stay here for a moment, I have a task for you. Goggles groaned. More danger for me, yay. How could I not be excited? Torture me more, Daddy. Clearly, I'm a masochist for staying here. Rollin laughed uproariously, patting Goggles' shoulder. You'll be fine. Stay safe out there. All the military officials shuffled out. Not a single one of them seemed to even care for Lionel's plan. It was either they truly couldn't be bothered, or they had already built a trust in him that was irrefutable. Goggles. Your task is the same as always, you're the key cog here. Goggles rolled his eyes. Of course he was. You want to take advantage of their slow network to hit them from the back, right? But the only way to make sure information doesn't spread too fast is little old me? Lionel grinned. Well, isn't that so? Goggles glared at Lionel. And my reward? What do you want? Lionel laughed. I want to marry my goddess, Elise. Lionel gave Goggles' forehead a karate chop. This young man could never stop screwing around. How was he supposed to promise him Roland's wife? Fine, fine. Goggles slinked off, his shoulder exaggeratedly slouched. I'll just slave away for the cause until one day I die on a nameless battlefield. No one to remember my name, and no woman to call wife. Oh, destiny. Why do you treat me so? Lionel shook his head, laughing. Goggles was indeed an important part of their operations. He had a sensory-type ability, but it was quite unique. It was similar to Lionel's simulation ability, except for the fact it all occurred on its own without conscious thought. This ability allowed Goggles to not only sense a problem before it happened, but also understand exactly what sort of cause and effect would force it to occur. This thus allowed him to stop this problem before it even began. The only drawback to this ability was that Goggles needed enough foundational information. The broader his target, the more vague his understanding of cause and effect was. The more focused his target, the sharper his senses became. At this moment, Goggles only had one task: take out all the messengers of the opposing kingdom. Not only that, but he had even one extra step of specificity. He only had to focus on messengers carrying information about the movements of their armies within a very specific time frame. His job was essentially to make their information late and dated. For Goggles, this sort of focused and specific task practically made him like an oracle who could gaze into the future. When Lionel first met him, he almost mistook him for a savant. This kind of chess piece. It was the kind any king would kill to have. Yet as cowardly as Goggles was, he had chosen to join their cause. Chapter 758. Chapter 758. Nice to meet you. Michael walked around with dark lines on his forehead, cups, tables and other furniture smashed all around him. As though this wasn't bad enough, he had torn a hole in his military tent out of rage, and a few of the comfort women were currently trying to sew it back together. But this only pissed him off even more. The corpse of one of these women was lying on the ground, having been killed by him in a fit of rage. But none of them dared to move her body. They could only step over her as they continued their attempt to sew the tear shut. As though by design, this of course managed to piss Michael off even more. Why wouldn't they stop sniveling and crying? It was just one dead woman, and now they suddenly couldn't take it? They were fine with servicing a dozen men during any given night, but murder was where they drew the line? Clearly, in his ridiculous tirade, Michael had completely forgotten that most of these women weren't here by choice. Fuck. Michael ripped one of the women away from the tear, ironically making it even wider as she subconsciously grabbed out. Damn it. The woman was quickly bent over a table, her dress being torn away and a sudden cry leaving her lips as she felt something enter her. Michael began to vent all his frustration, clearly not caring that he was using far too much strength. Sir Michael. At that moment, an attendant walked into the tent. Despite seeing the woman pressed into the table and Michael furiously humping her from the back, he didn't have much of a change in his expression, as though he was very much used to seeing such a scene. What the hell is it? We've gotten news of their movements. Michael's eyes went red with rage. Oh yeah? We've gotten more word, is it? What about the first time at the Alpes? The second time at the Triant Forest? Why am I spinning my army around in circles just to find cities they've abandoned and hardly touched? Are you fucking with me? The woman below Michael whimpered. The hand Michael used to press her face into the table exerted too much pressure, making it impossible for her to breathe. This time we've done more due diligence. We are certain that this information is at most 3 days old. We will most definitely be able to intercept them if we move now. From my understanding, it seemed that the net they cast to stop our messengers finally showed a flaw. This time, we've got them. Michael squeezed and threw the woman he had bent over to the side. She gasped for air like a fish out of water, scrambling to return to her work mending the tent's fabric. Why didn't you say that from the very beginning? Michael roared. We're moving out. Michael rode a magnificent steed. It had a muscular body that seemed pumped of steroids and flowing hair that made up its mane and covered its hooves. It almost looked like it was galloping on air with the way it moved. The army tore through the plains. I don't like this valley, circle around it. Michael roared. Even though Michael seemed hot-headed, he was still a general with decades of experience. He refused to be led by the nose. He would be cautious whenever there was an opportunity to do so. Circling around the valley would at most add half a day. Rather than harming them, this would only help. Instead of arriving in the morning, they would be arriving in the afternoon. If they managed to catch the rebel army mid-siege, this war was as good as over. However, what Michael didn't expect was to have to pull the reins of his horse, forcing himself to come to a grinding halt, barely a day later. Before them, a river that had never appeared before had suddenly appeared as though a god reached down and created it on a whim. It wasn't very wide, just 5 or so meters. It probably wasn't very deep either, maybe a meter or 2 at most. Yet, for an unprepared army like theirs, it was enough to bring them to a screeching halt. Go around? They had no idea how this river appeared here in the first place, just suddenly appearing at the end of a forest of sparse trees. Without knowing this, how could they even make such a decision? Was the only option to go across? But if they were forced to cut down some trees to build a bridge, they would add another half-day to their journey. By then, they might as well have not gotten the message on time at all. If they tried to brute force their way across, it would be too easy to get caught with their pants down. It was exactly then that Michael heard something he least wanted to hear at this moment. Charge. Michael's expression changed. His neck snapped back, suddenly realizing that an army was approaching from his back. How the hell did they get behind us? Michael froze. The valley. He had chosen to go around. But what if there was an army hiding within the whole time, waiting for him to make exactly that decision and prepared to pounce on him? If he went into the valley, he was finished. If he went around the valley, he was finished. Cross the river. Michael roared. But as soon as his command fell and began to be acted upon, the sound of arrows whistling through the wind came from the other side of the river. Hiding within the widely spaced trees, archers Michael hadn't even noticed before suddenly made their presence known. Fuck! Michael roared, charging his horse through the shallow waters to make it to the other side. He would hack these archers to pieces. Whoa now. I can't let you do that. In a streak of golden light, Michael suddenly found his path blocked by a boy who was young enough to be his grandson. Lionel smiled lightly, holding a spear in his hand. Michael the Sturdy, right? Nice to meet you. Chapter 759. Chapter 759. No choice. The instant Lionel's greeting fell, so too did his spear. Michael's expression changed, reacting quickly. He was a veteran of battle after all. And as far as he was concerned, Lionel challenging him on foot while he sat atop his horse was one of the most foolish decisions he could have ever made. Michael pulled at his reins, pulling a massive hammer from his back, and using the momentum of his horse reeling back, and stamping down to swing with all his might. But as though he had seen through Michael's ploy from the very beginning, the trajectory of Lionel's spear had already shifted, its long, flexible body snapping in the air at a flick of his wrist and shooting through to the steed's falling throat like a meteor. With how things were now, the momentum of the horse's stomp would only help Lionel shear apart its throat. In fact, its current situation was no different to have jumped into the air for an attack despite the fact its back hooves were still on the ground. There was no way for it to change its trajectory. However, even Lionel was surprised by the result. Sturdy. As though enveloped by a holy light, man and beast accepted a pillar of blessings from above. In that instant, Lionel's spear reached the black steed's throat, prepared to shear it apart completely. But what he actually found was a sturdy steel wall. Lionel's brows shut up. With swift steps he retreated. The heavy swing of Michael's hammer left his hair whipping about, his clothes even threatening to shatter beneath the wind pressure alone. The shave had been so close that Lionel could see the hammer's body pass a mere centimeter from the tip of his nose. Lionel didn't panic. He felt that that was at best a temporary invulnerability. There was no way an ability could so casually block such a strong strike from him. The issue wasn't just how strong his strike had been, but also the quality of his weapon. There was no way for a quasi-bronze weapon to be so easily dealt with by a barrier. The most logical explanation that this was a temporary matter. The amount of energy it would take to sustain such a thing would be too great. And Lionel was exactly right. He analyzed the situation perfectly. The instant Michael's swing missed, he had already shot forward again, pressing forward knowing that such a heavy weapon couldn't be recovered so easily. The follow-through of Michael's swing didn't throw him off balance, but he was definitely in no position to attack right this second. In that split moment, Lionel's spear struck out a dozen times in the blink of an eye. An explosion of meteoric impact, raining down on the steed and Michael. As though crimson roses were blooming in skies, they opened up a current of red and black, covering the duo whole. It looked as though no one could survive such a thing, but Lionel still explosively retreated the moment he finished. And it was exactly at that moment that Michael and his steed leapt out from the flames licking at their armor but ultimately leaving them unscathed. Michael raised his hammer to the sky, roaring with all his might. For a moment, it seemed as though his mighty shout would collapse the sparse forest around them. All around him, his men were falling like flies. He couldn't do anything about the archers sniping them down even though he had crossed to the other side of the river. Nor could he do anything about the surging army pincering them from the back, at least not directly. But that didn't mean that he would take this lying down. I am a titled knight of His Majesty Alexander the Apex. I am Michael the Sturdy. I have legs of iron, arms of steel, and a heart of stone. My defenses are eternal. Michael's army roared to match his words. Eternal. Shimmering pillars of light descended upon the whole army. Each and every man seemed to gain immunity for a moment. Some used it as an opportunity to charge across the river, others turned back, facing the enemies toward their back line. Lionel's eyes narrowed. It seems that though the invulnerability was indeed temporary, I underestimated the buff to their defense. Lionel couldn't help but chuckle to himself. This buff from just a single title knight under Alexander was already enough to put his metal body to shame. What a fascinating ability indeed. If this was what the sturdy title could do, what exactly did Apex do? Lionel didn't realize it, but for some reason he was eager to see. Dodging swiftly backward, Lionel nimbly leapt out of the way of Michael's swinging hammer. The titled knight left absolute devastation in his wake, chasing after Lionel with an undying fervor. Every time Lionel's spear snaked outward, making contact, he would barely pierce a centimeter or two of flesh, resulting in what was nothing more than superficial wounds to a man and beast so powerful. The worst part was that Sturdy seemed to have an exceptionally high elemental resistance. Even with a perfectly timed meteoric impact, the damage was nothing more than a bit of charred skin. Lionel had a feeling that this wasn't just about the sturdy ability, but was definitely related to the armors Michael and his horse were wearing. He had been intrigued by it ever since he saw that fat man at Rollin and Elise's home. But, apparently, that had been nothing more than the tip of the iceberg. Golden lights enveloped Lionel's body as he shifted from side to side. He slid with ease through the forest, and though the trees were as much as 10 meters apart most of the time, Michael was clearly not having as easy a time. For people moving as fast as the two of them, what was a 10-meter distance worth? It felt like he was forced to circle around another every exchange. However, Lionel likewise was making no headway. And judging by Michael's current battle style, he wasn't worried about a time limit for his ability either. I guess there's no other choice. Chapter 760. Chapter 760. Fall. Lionel flipped his palm over, causing his spear to vanish. Michael seemed to want to press his advantage the moment he saw this. He didn't believe that Lionel was giving up, but that didn't matter. All that did matter to him was that this was a chance to finally end this battle. Though Lionel had seemed to survive so long because of his speed and agility, Michael could tell that another large portion of the reason was the length and reach of his spear. He had never seen such a long spear before. The crafts of their kingdom were excellent, but the logistics of forming such a long and flexible spear was a nightmare, especially if you wanted it to carry any strength. If it wasn't for his sturdy title, he felt that he would have already lost his longtime partner. However, would Michael really have the chance to press such a small advantage? Lionel's spear had hardly disappeared before another one appeared in its place. And though this one was exactly a meter short of 4, Michael's pupils immediately constricted. It was the kind of spear that held a presence of its own, a fiery aura that seemed to want to battle against even its own owner. Just laying there in Lionel's palm, it made the energies of the world tremble, its mere existence exuding an undying superiority. Lionel twirled his spear in his hands, its double blade slicing apart trees tens of meters away with its wind pressure alone. He hardly put any effort in, yet the devastation he wrought had reached an all-new level. Let's end this. Lionel shot forward. However, Michael immediately retreated, his pupils constricted into pinholes. He didn't dare to meet that spear with his hammer. He could already see the future where a weapon that had followed him for decades would be split into two, taking his arm along with it. However, Michael's wishes didn't matter in this regard, not even in the slightest. Lionel's spinning spear came to an abrupt halt, the sound of tearing air making Michael's hair stand on end. At that moment, Lionel pierced forward. It's not enough, the range is too shallow. He won't make it. Michael remained composed, ready to look for a lane to counterattack. If he ran from this battlefield, His army would lose the buff he had given them. The instant this happened, the slaughter would ensue once more. Even though at this point the situation still wasn't in their favor, it was at least far better than the alternative. And as long as he killed Lionel, the momentum would shift and victory would be his. Such a ragtag group of commoners. What did they know about honor? About duty? About bravery? The moment their spiritual leader collapsed, so too would they. Michael's eyes lit with fury and contempt. But what happened next made him feel as though his whole world was flipping. The instant Lionel reached the limit of his piercing movement, completely short as Michael had expected, he suddenly burst past it. Lionel's spear splintered into two of its three segments, a snaking chain shooting through the air as the blade continued forward. Michael couldn't even react before his valiant steed of decades had its throat pierced, a pain neigh followed by gurgling blood leaving it as it died. Lionel's spear spun in his hands, ripping upward. The spear's blade followed suit, tearing through a defense he could hardly dent moments ago as though a knife through butter. A hot rain of blood blinded Michael for a moment as his steed's head was split in two. Even though he reacted quickly, blocking his front with his massive hammer, he found that Lionel's next attack came from his side. Lionel's spear separated into three parts. As it spun in his hands, it was almost like a massive meat grinder. Michael couldn't even reacted before his body, along with his horses, was bisected four different ways. The rotation came to a grinding halt, Lionel's spear snapping back together. As though the clicking noise was a sign for the world to begin moving forward again. Dozens of trees in the surroundings were sliced into 4 or 5 pieces, collapsing to the ground like piles of firewood. Lionel looked toward Michael's collapsing, gory figure in silence before looking at his spear. He had most definitely not expected the difference to be so drastic. The scariest part was that at this point he could only make use of this spear's innate sharpness. He couldn't even pour force into it. Yet just its sharpness alone was able to have such an effect. It felt as though the same strength he applied to quasi-bronze spears, when applied with this quasi-silver spear, was easily 100 times more destructive. Lionel clearly didn't understand the level of privilege he had. What he was doing was the equivalent of taking a weapon forged by a god into a world of mortals. How could it not have this sort of effect? But it was for this exact reason Lionel never casually took this spear out. He could use it here because he was in a zone. Logically, he either found a way to leave this place or he would die, so whether people knew about it or not was irrelevant. However, things were different in the outside world. It wasn't like he could just leave everything behind and expect it all to be erased. Lionel shook his head. The outside world didn't matter right now. He had to focus on this task so he could get out of here as quickly as possible. Since he had the advantage of being in a zone, there was no need to hide the strength of his treasures here. Taking a deep breath, Lionel shot into the battlefield. He didn't bother to change his spear again. Since he was free to do as he pleased in this zone, he might as well take it as an opportunity to train in controlling it. Since speed was his goal, why would he hold back with his strength? Unfortunately for the kingdom, the fall of this titled knight would only be the first and most definitely not the last. Chapter 761. Chapter 761. Visitor. The moment Michael died, the buff his warriors had gained vanished. In an instant, a battle that could have been described in terms of 60 to 40 had become 90 to 10. When Lionel joined, especially with his quasi-silver spear, the result was devastating. Not a single on the kingdom's men survived, though this wasn't out of Lionel not wanting to spare them. It was clear that this Alexander had an iron grip on his men, though there had been plenty of those willing to join their cause in the cities they had conquered to this point. They had all been people of common birth. There were very few nobles who chose to take their side. Obviously, Alexander the Apex had a very tight hold on these people, likely holding the lives of their families over their heads. Of course, Lionel felt a small bit of sympathy for this. But he had always believed that no singular life was worth more than another, even if that was his own. The lives of these soldiers' families in the capital weren't worth more than the commoners who suffered every day under their rule. The lives of the soldiers themselves weren't more valuable than the commoners who fought beneath Lionel's banner. Not to mention the fact that since these warriors had chosen to die on the battlefield, their families would be just fine. Other than a small pity he felt, most of Lionel's rage was aimed toward a singular man. The news of Lionel's army taking out a titled knight spread like wildfire. But nothing was more shocking than the sweeping conquest that occurred right afterward. Lionel doubled back to the cities his 4 armies had probed in these last 2 months. Each and every one was manned by an earl, making them among the largest cities this kingdom had to offer. They had only barely begun to recover from Lionel's first assault when they suddenly found themselves under a second siege. But to make matters worse, Lionel was no longer using his quasi-bronze spears. Every time his spear spun, even without the use of technique, he reaped dozens of lives. And maybe the ironic part was that it was better when Lionel didn't use a technique at all. Not only did this preserve his stamina, but the extension of these techniques weren't as potent as meeting the blade of the double-headed spear alone. If Lionel was just powerful, things might still be fine. But the issue was that he paired this with seamless tactics that completely stifled the kingdom. It felt that in just a year, half of their territory had fallen. Yet, they were supposedly facing a ragtag bunch of commoners. Not only did those 4 cities swiftly fall, but reports that a main water source had been diverted reached the ears of the kingdom soon afterward. Somehow, Lionel had managed to both block a main river source and divert it. What was truly baffling about this was that he used this diverted river source not only as a tactic to pincer Michael and ultimately kill him, but he simultaneously used it to give his new claimed territory a steady supply of water and resources that was impossible for the capital to cut off. At the same time, this diverted water source resulted in a shortage of clean water for 3 separate dukedoms located nearer to the capital. It felt like he was killing 10 birds with a single stone. When the crafters learned how Lionel had done it, they stood shocked before the collapsed mountain turned immovable dam. Their faces paled from shock. Facing this kind of genius, weren't they all finished? It felt like the next year was nothing but the capital receiving one slap in the face after another. For more titled knights fell, each more powerful than the last. The kingdom had lost 40% of their territory, and at the moment, they were in the process of being completely starved out, their resources systematically claimed by Lionel one after another. By the second year, the kingdom was being brought to its knees and had less than 30% of its land left, most of which was a vast expanse of natural protections keeping the capital within its turtle shell. It was then sometime during a heavy storm of winter that Lionel received a visitor. "You little brat." Rollin kept Goggles in a firm headlock, his legs wrapped around the latter's hips for extra leverage. The rest of the military tent chugged beer, laughing heartily at the spectacle. "Damn it. I just asked for one night. With my wife." "Yes." Goggles squeezed out shamelessly. "She's too good for you." Roland's headlock tightened, Goggles' eyes almost popping out. The latter's face turned a bright shade of red as he struggled, trying to tickle at Roland's side so he would let go. Lionel chuckled lightly. As usual, he was sipping at a fruity drink rather than the hard liquor of the others. Elise had actually personally made this batch for him. He had to admit that that little girl was indeed as close to a guardian angel they all had. At that moment, a messenger came into the tent. Saluting all lieutenants, the young man said respectfully, an air of fanaticism lighting his eyes. "There is a diplomat here to see the general." "A diplomat? From where?" Lionel asked. "The Oryx Kingdom, sir." Lionel's eyes narrowed. At the same time, the rowdy atmosphere of the tent grew more somber. It could be said most felt that the capital was pretty much finished, even though Lionel had never expressed such an opinion. However, if there was to be a wild card, it would definitely come from the Oryx Kingdom. If they threatened to attack them from the back now, all their momentum would fizzle out. Their upstart group, even after 2 years, didn't have a strong enough foundation to deal with such things. It would be one thing if Lionel had had these 2 years to bolster them with his crafts. But after entering this world, aside from his spear domain ring which seemed unaffected by the odd restrictions of this zone, Lionel hadn't been able to bring anything else with him. This included little Tolly. At that moment, Rollin let go of Goggles just in time for Lionel to look over. Goggles shook his head, seemingly understanding Lionel's meaning. No danger, Huck. Lionel nodded. Let them in. Chapter 762. Chapter 762. Cannot. The tent fell into silence as a cloaked figure walked in. Outside their expectation, they weren't hit with a wall of the foul stench one would expect from an oryx. In addition, though this figure was actually quite tall, in comparison to other oryx, they were still lacking by 2 or 3 heads. Could it be that the oryx had sent a human to negotiate for them? This was a thought that Lionel couldn't help but have. From what he knew, the oryx kingdom of this world did indeed have humans under their rule. In fact, during his very first battle here, it was the humans under their banner that he fought. However, he found it hard to believe that for their first contact, the oryx would send a human to represent them. Though Lionel had grown up in a world where most problems of race had been laid to rest, he had quickly realized that such problems were dotted all over the dimensional verse. It was just that instead of harping on skin color, it was a matter of human versus creatures he had only ever seen from fantasy novels. Of course, humans would always be humans. Wherever there were divisions to be made, as long as there wasn't a strong overarching power like the Ascension Empire, they would make these divisions. This was all to say that the oryx definitely treated the humans under their charge like secondary citizens. So, how could they possibly send one for such an important thing as first contact? Greetings. The robed figure gave a polite greeting. As the representation of the oryx kingdom, he obviously couldn't bow, but he had done more than enough. Lionel continued to scan the figure before him for a moment. I have been looking forward to communicating with the oryx kingdom for a long time, he said with a light smile. Yes, we have heard a lot about the general. After hearing so much, our king couldn't help but be intrigued himself. It is an honor to meet the man who has brought the human kingdom to its knees. Lionel and the figure exchanged some pleasantries before the latter was invited to sit. Lionel didn't really care much for etiquette. As far as he was concerned, he wasn't really a king to begin with. He didn't mind sharing a table with an envoy. So, to what do we owe this pleasure? Lionel finally asked. The envoy, hidden beneath his black robes, took a moment before speaking. I am sure that you understand the sort of precarious position your rebel army is in, correct? The atmosphere immediately took a turn for the worst. Never mind the fact that even the usually cheery Rollin was frowning. Even Goggles, who would usually want nothing to do with this dangerous stuff, was practically staring daggers at the envoy. However, Lionel continued to smile. We would only be in a precarious position if the oryx kingdom chose to attack, don't you think? The envoy's gaze seemed to look toward Lionel, his eyes like 2 dull balls of light hovering in the shadows of his hoodie. It was almost as though he couldn't understand why Lionel was so uncaring. He had known that his words would be contentious and even seen as a veiled threat. In this era, though there are unspoken rules about preserving the lives of envoys like him, who could do anything if a king lost their temper. So this envoy was probably even ready to lose his life today. But what he hadn't expected was for Lionel to reply to his threat with a smile. Please don't misunderstand. The envoy replied. This isn't a matter of choice, it would be one of necessity. The human kingdom isn't as simple as you think it is. We oryx are superior in every way. Whether it be resources, strength of army, numbers, territory, politics, culture. You all have seen the corruption at the borders of your human kingdom yourselves. Eating at the borders, at the very least, should be very easy for us. Yet, we only ever send our lesser warriors into skirmishes and never lead full assaults. There is a reason for this. Lionel's expression finally showed a slight shift. However, even then it was just a slight raise of his brows. So tell me then. Lionel began. What would you like us to do? The envoy took a deep breath. We of the Oryx Kingdom hope that your rebel army will retreat from this endeavor. If you choose to do so, you will be handsomely rewarded. You, General, will be rewarded the title of Count. As for your lieutenants and warriors, for the best of them we can provide barony titles and knighthood. At that moment, a fiery redhead amongst the group couldn't seem to take it anymore. Her hair really seemed to be a wreath of flames as she stood and slammed her seemingly delicate palm to the oak table. Bang! The entire tent quaked even down to the ground beneath their feet. You want us to do what? This redhead was indeed a beauty. Among those who had joined Lionel's cause, she was amongst the earliest, and even happened to have once been the daughter of a baron. She was one of the very few nobles who had chosen to join their cause. Of course, she had her reasons. While the other nobles had their hearts gripped by Alexander, Gertrude and long since lost her family. Ironically, they had been executed by Alexander long ago. It was safe to say that her fury toward the human kingdom was no weaker than any of the commoners of their army. Gertrude. Lionel's even voice snapped the former young noble out of her rage. Though still seething, she slowly sat, her gaze flickering. Lionel looked toward the envoy. And what do you plan to do with all the people we've taken to protecting? The weak? The women? The children? The elderly? It can't be that your Oryx kingdom want to take them all in too, right? Lionel asked this knowing the answer very well. If they accepted all the people Lionel had conquered, what would be the difference between that and actually conquering the land? I am sure you already know the answer, General. These people must stay in the human kingdom. We cannot accept them all. Chapter 763. Chapter 763 Unknown. A heaviness hung over them all. It was as though all the happiness had been sapped away. It was the kind of fog that wouldn't easily be removed. They were all intelligent. They understood the kind of weight this sort of visit brought with it. It was likely that the Oryx kingdom had already chosen to attack as long as they dared to reject. As for why they feared the human kingdom so much, who knew? It was unlikely that this envoy would have a reason for this. And even if they did, it was even more unlikely that he would tell. When the standing between two parties was so far apart, an equal exchange of information was impossible. Though this seemed to be a peaceful talk, it was ultimately an ultimatum. They would either do as they were asked and receive their rewards as good dogs, or they would face the consequences. MMIC. Lionel finally broke the silence, slowly rising to his feet. So, the Oryx kingdom would like the pain and suffering of our people to be the buffer between you and this future you fear so much. A noble cause indeed. Lionel's voice no longer carried the smiling tone it had had since the beginning. However, it wasn't filled with rage either. Rather, it was very even with hardly any inflections. If they didn't know better, they would think that an AI had spoken these words. However, that feeling soon vanished when Lionel spoke again. This time, it was low, forceful, filled with a charisma that washed the lands in a radiant light. We will not be your sacrifice. Lionel turned to the envoy, his gaze looking down from above. I do not know what it is you fear, nor do I care. What I do know is that in my eyes, you aren't much different from the human kingdom. If you would like to attack, come. Lionel's voice seemed to carry the weight of the air with it, causing a sudden stillness to be swiftly followed by a surge. Even the heavy flaps of the tent couldn't help but kick up, whipping about beneath the forcefulness. We will show you the might that brought the kingdom you fear so much to its knees. Silence fell, however the heat seemed to rise. A fire lit themselves in the gaze of the lieutenants. The pressure the envoy faced multiplied several-fold. The fact he could remain seated in his position at all was impressive. After a long while the envoy lowered his head. I understand. It seems that I have overstayed my welcome. I wish you the best. With these words, the envoy bowed. Escort our guest out. Lionel said faintly. With those words spoken, two lieutenants rose, doing exactly that. Lionel suddenly chuckled. What are you all so down for? Is there a need to worry with me here? Lionel's grin seemed to light up the room. Goggles snorted. You were going to get me killed one day anyway. This way, it'll just be a lot sooner. Those words immediately got Goggles a slap to the back of the head. Hey, pause off. With that kind of attitude, it's no wonder you still don't have a wife, Goggles. Gertrude smiled, seemingly enjoying Roland's slap to Goggles very much. I don't have a wife because my dream woman was stolen from me. Goggles protested, rubbing the back of his head. This, rightfully, earned him another headlock from Roland. Laughter returned to the room as Goggles struggled. The clanging of drinks and the swinging of beer began once more. But it was clear that there was still a slight fog hanging over them all. They chugged their alcohol just a bit more enthusiastically, spoke just a little less confidently, laughed just a little less heartily. The night waned, and eventually everyone began to stumble back to their own homes. The only ones who remained were the poor single folk with no families to go back to. A brutish man wrapped an arm around Lionel's shoulders. "What do you say, General? Want to head to the brothel? I hear this city we just conquered has a really good one." Lionel rolled his eyes. "Get some sleep, Costello. You're drunk." Costello laughed heartily. "Only if I get to embrace two busted babes. Miles, Austin, let's go. Those soft clouds are waiting. Keep your gross talk away from the General." Gertrude snapped, sending a kick at Costello's ass. "Oh, right. We can't be all so lucky as to have a beauty like you pining after us." "Who's pining?" Gertrude growled, reaching for her halberd only to remember she hadn't brought it with her. Costello, Miles and Austin's laughter rung as they ran from the tent, leaving no one but Lionel, Goggles and Gertrude behind. Goggles, who was lying on the floor, opened a single eye. Noticing the odd atmosphere and realizing his plan to just sleep here for the night wasn't working out, he hopped up and coughed lightly. "You two mingle. My wife. I mean my daughter. Forget it, I'm going to the brothel too. Don't you dare tell my goddess about this." Goggles scurried away under Gertrude's deathly glare and flushed expression. At the moment, Gertrude's countenance might have been as red as her flowing hair, but it only made her more beautiful. The way her leather armor clung tightly to her curves, outlining her bust and hips to an almost intoxicating degree. The way the slight bit of her lower lip almost drew blood from their plumpness. The way her emerald eyes sparkled even beneath the dim light. She looked like a woman ready to finally bloom. However, just as quickly as she was prepared to bud, she wilted even faster. Lionel rose with a smile. "Have a nice night, Gertrude. Get home safely, I have something to handle." Before Gertrude could say anything, Lionel had already vanished, leaving her looking down at her own chest wondering if she wasn't big enough to be considered a soft cloud. She had half a mind to go and measure herself against those prostitutes. But her logic slapped her back to reality. She sighed, a sad smile on her face. In the depths of the night, a robed figure rode its steed like a shadow, reaching a speed that seemed beyond what a normal horse should be capable of even within the fourth dimension. Suddenly, that horse came to a grinding halt as the figure pulled on its reins. "It can't be that the mighty general wants to kill me just for passing on some words?" Lionel stood before the horse in silence, his gaze even, his breathing unhurried, and his purpose unknown. Chapter 764. Chapter 764. Envoy Lionel didn't respond to the envoy's words. He simply stood there silently, his expression not giving way to any emotion. It was as though he didn't even notice that there was someone before him. At this moment, they were in the dead of winter. Heavy snow fell all around, coating the ground, the trees, and sprinkling through the air as though to coat the whole world in white. Still, the cold didn't seem to bother either of the two men as they faced off in an endless snowy plain. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to seek reprieve, nowhere to run. It was then that both men suddenly moved. Lionel's palm flipped over, revealing a 4-meter-long, flexible spear. Aside from his quasi-silver spear, this one was quickly becoming one of his favorites. The range of flexibility and freedom it gave him made his battle style reach an impossible level of fluidity. At the same moment, the envoy didn't bother to stay on his horse. He had read all the reports about Lionel. This was a man who never rode a horse, yet had felled more titled knights than anyone else in history. If there was anyone confident in battling a man and a steed together, it was Lionel. In that case, why allow him the chance to do what he was familiar with? His palm flipped over to reveal an outrageous monstrosity of a saber. Its blade was an obscene 3 meters long alone. It had a width of almost 2 feet and a curve that almost made it look like a scythe as opposed to a saber. Yet it had a thickness as thin as 2 or 3 strands of hair. When the saber was swung, it felt like the wind itself was being split in two. If swung at the perfect angle, the blade was so thin that it was almost impossible to spot. And whether by coincidence or not, This envoy seemed capable of finding this perfect angle with ease. A streak of gold and one of black tore through the snowy plain, their clash causing a whirlwind of violent explosions to swirl around them. Despite the size of their weapons, the two men seemed to exchange hundreds of blows in a single breath. And as though that wasn't enough, their speed only seemed to get faster and faster. Gold lights enveloped Lionel's body, massive white gold wings spanning 10 meters to his left and right blooming from his back. Ancient patterns of gold began to outline each individual feather. It felt that with each passing moment, the pair became less illusory and more corporeal, as though Lionel was birthing true wings from nothing more than light. One would have thought that light elemental force would be difficult to gather in the depths of the night like this. Yet Lionel seemed completely unaffected. These 2 years, just because he had been stuck here, didn't mean that he was stagnant. With a single flap, he retreated more than 100 meters in a single step. His feet stamped the ground, causing a tsunami of snow to rise into the air. The wall of white rose up more than 10 meters, and was at least 20 across. Yet, what was most shocking about it all was that this was simply the result of the earth beneath heeding Lionel's call. Lionel roared, his chest expanding as bronze runes surged over his body. The robes he wore shattered beneath the surge of force, unable to handle it. Beneath the shimmering white gold of his massive wings, Lionel's bronze runes stood out all the more. Under the night sky, he looked no different from a Roman god descended from the skies above, his halo hanging above his head. The massive slab of stone that Lionel had lifted from the ground shattered into tens of pieces, rising into the air to form several stones of over a meter in diameter each. Armageddon. In that instant, the stones erupted with flames. In the skies, as though tens of miniature suns had appeared, they raged with a fiery light, their surfaces beginning to melt in a near instant. The envoy's pupils constricted. What kind of attack was this? Something of this caliber could level an entire city. The battle hadn't reached such a peak yet. He couldn't understand why Lionel had dared to come to fight him like this in the first place, especially after he had traveled so far away from their encampment. But now it really seemed like he wanted to kill him. The envoy roared, raising his saber into the skies. A violent black energy coiled around him, forming countless black chains from seemingly thin air. The ground around him suddenly exploded, the expanse of snow being washed away beneath his rippling might. His robes fluttered in the raging wind, his eyes trained on the meteors descending toward him. Ha! The envoy stomped his feet. In that instant, the earth seemed to respond to his call. In one moment, there was nothing. But in the immediate next, sparkling spikes of black shot out from the ground, impaling the descending meteors and causing explosions that rocked throughout the night. Lionel's eyes narrowed. Those pillars were definitely not normal. In fact, he could faintly tell that they stood on a level nearing his Scarlet Star Force. Somehow, the spikes seemed to be both made out of small dust particles, yet remained solid at the same time. Each of these little particles radiated out with a faint black light that made it look as though it was sparkling beneath the high moon. It was as though the envoy was controlling iron shavings and darkness to form them. If the envoy had heard Lionel's thoughts, he would have been shocked. Just a short observation. Yet he was already so close to the truth. However, no matter what the envoy did, Lionel wasn't shaken. To use a force on this level at this envoy's strength was akin to painting oneself into a corner. There was a reason Lionel didn't use his Scarlet Star Force so casually. As expected, the envoy was truly gasping for breath. He hadn't thought that he would be forced to use such an ability, but Lionel's combination attack had strength beyond his wildest imagination. If he had used normal Earth to counter, those meteors would have blasted through with ease. He couldn't understand how Lionel could pull Earth capable of withstanding such heat from the ground so casually. Of course, what he didn't know was that Lionel's Earth elemental force was variant just like his. However, this didn't mean that the envoy was finished. He gripped his saber. Since the pillars had already been formed, manipulating them was much easier. The chains that floated around his body constricted as Lionel's wings flapped one more time. He appeared 10 meters before the envoy. In that moment, the latter was prepared to turn the earthen spikes of shimmering black light toward Lionel. But he stopped when it seemed that Lionel had no intention of attacking. In fact, Lionel stood there unmoving, his eyes calmly observing the black chains wrapping the envoy. Earth elemental force. Dark elemental force. Star elemental force. The envoy froze when he heard this. Chaotic particle force. Number 1 in Earth elemental forces, top 3 in Dark elemental forces, top 10 in Star elemental forces. Lionel concluded. Your talent is quite high for an envoy, don't you think? The envoy's eyes narrowed as he gazed toward Lionel. You were testing me? I guessed that you were an oryx a long time ago. Lionel said plainly. But your cloak blocks senses? But you don't look or smell like an oryx. The envoy didn't say a word, but clearly this was what he meant as well. This shouldn't have been possible. Lionel didn't explain himself either, at least not with words. He had seen a long lineup of possible evolution paths for the oryx in that hall, so he knew well that a stature like the one this young man had wasn't impossible. As for how he had known, it was just a guess. This envoy hadn't tried very hard to convince them to change their minds, and also didn't have the tact one would expect the representation of a nation to have. So why don't you tell me the true purpose you had for coming? Lionel responded. The envoy remained silent for a long while before he finally removed his cloak. What was beneath made Lionel raise an eyebrow. It was a young man with flowing white hair and handsome, delicate features that would make any woman and some men swoon. His skin was quite tanned, giving him an excellent, exotic sort of contrast, and his eyes were the very same bright white his hair was. Growing from this young man's forehead were 2 branching horns that were a very pure shade of white, yet they didn't seem to detract from his beauty at all. Even the vertical slit between his brows was completely unable to do so. Aside from these clearly oryx-like features, the young man was strikingly human. If Lionel didn't know better, he would think that this young man was some sort of demon prince risen from hell. And maybe in some ways he was. This is just my natural state. My battle state, however, is much different. Chapter 765. Chapter 765. Stall. The moment the young man's words fell, his body grew a size. From shorter than Lionel, he became an entire head taller. Pristine white fur began to coat his entire body. His cloak burst apart, revealing a rugged appearance. Of the parts Lionel could see, the only parts that seemed free of hair were the young man's chest and chiseled torso. He almost looked like a king of apes for a moment. But what was strongest was the sudden explosion of a smell so strong Lionel almost passed out from exposure to it alone. It was so potent that he had no choice but to stop breathing entirely. Even trying to do so through his mouth had him feeling as though he was trying to swallow fumes wafting from a vat of vinegar. The smell is somewhat strong for you humans, the envoy said nonchalantly. It was clear from his words that though his face remained expressionless, he took some pleasure in Lionel's discomfort. He obviously didn't like being led by the nose as he had just been, so he would enjoy this small victory. Lionel was inwardly relieved when the envoy returned to his normal form. He could tell that such a scent would be extremely attractive to female oryx. But Lionel felt he would suffocate to death in its presence. Compared to the oryx he had met, the difference was so striking that there was really no comparison at all. Lionel could tell, though, that the envoy hadn't just shown him this battle form to force him to smell such a thing. It was also to show that he had yet to battle at his true peak state. As taxing as chaotic particle force was, unlike Lionel's Scarlet Star force, it didn't damage the envoy's body. All he was experiencing now was fatigue and nothing more. If Lionel really pushed him, especially since he had already formed such large reserves, this battle would definitely be in his favor. However, Lionel didn't mind what the envoy was thinking. His purpose here was much different from this. He had already probed what he needed to probe. What he needed to do now was talk. Now that we've gotten pleasantries out of the way, do you mind telling me what kind of status you have among the oryx? Lionel asked. The envoy remained silent, seemingly trying to decide whether he should answer or not. No, I think it would be better for me to ask which of the oryx kingdom's princes are you? The envoy's pupils constricted into pinholes. You can't think that these matters could be hidden? No matter what kingdom it is, falsely representing them would be a crime punishable by death. and am willing to guess that the Oryx Kingdom actually did plan to send a real envoy who was, for whatever reason, intercepted by you before they could fulfill their duty. Anyone daring enough to do this, and even so casually return to the Oryx Kingdom right after without special means, is definitely of high standing. Your actions seem to show that you don't particularly care whether you get caught by your kingdom or not, which means you're confident in not being punished. Of course you could be, I don't know, a duke? Trying to sow chaos and look for a chance to take the throne for yourself. But you are too young, one. And secondly, once again, your actions aren't secretive enough. Lionel was able to spend hours drinking with his lieutenants and still catch up to this prince because his tracks were so obvious. Of course, Lionel was also likely one of the very best trackers in existence, especially with the new abilities he had formulated for himself in the last 2 years, but he hadn't even needed to use them to find this young man. I am Elther Yumrake, 3rd Prince of the Oryx Kingdom. Lionel smiled. It's nice to meet you, Elther. Lionel had given up on telling people his name after these 2 years. For some reason, no matter how many times he told people what it was, they would still call him the general and nothing else. Even after so long, he couldn't quite wrap his mind around this. I hope that you understand that even though you've learned of my identity, this changes nothing. The Oryx will still stop you from attacking the capital. The only thing my actions have done is give you a small buffer of time. You say this, but wouldn't I just have to kidnap and hold you hostage? Lionel said casually. You're overestimating my value, General. Am I? You may not have stepped off of this world, but do you think those with chaotic particle force are common? Whether you know or not, your family likely see you as the future of the Oryx Kingdom. It's even possible that they're only willing to take a back seat and not poke the bear that is Alexander the Apex so that you have time to grow. Knowing this, do you still think I'm overestimating your value? Elther's heart trembled. Looking into Lionel's cold, calculating eyes, he suddenly felt the same fear his enemies had every time they met on the battlefield. He could hardly understand how a person could see through so much with so little information. The chains that floated around Elther rattled as though he was prepared to spring to action at any moment. He felt the tension even down to his very bones. However, I am not here to antagonize the Oryx, Lionel finally said. Elther felt himself deflate at that moment. He couldn't understand. He was a prince. Why did he feel so much pressure in the face of a man who was born a commoner? I will still need you to do something for me in exchange for your freedom, though. Lionel continued. And what is that? You need to stall. I need 2 months. In 2 months, the capital will fall and Alexander's head will be in my hands. Chapter 766. Chapter 766. Armageddon. Even long after he had left Lionel, Elther still felt his heart pounding. For the first time, even as a prince, he felt as though he should bow down to a knee before a man. He had never felt such emotion before, not even before his own father. Somewhere deep inside, he had already admitted to himself that if the Oryx and the general were to fight, even if they gained small advantages in the beginning, even if it seemed that the general might lose in the end, it would be they who ultimately suffered. Elther clenched his fists. He had never really wanted to be prince in his life. This was why he had always been happy to be born third. He was content to allow his elder brothers to take the reins. All he wanted to be was a powerful warrior. The most powerful. However, the day his third eye was awakened, it all changed. The looks his father gave him shifted from love and a doting adoration to look of expectation, hope, and pride. It was the kind of look Elther had always wanted to see, but he had wanted to see them for the sake of support toward him chasing his own dreams. He wanted to be the spearhead that finally unified their world under one banner. He didn't want to be the ruler that did so. Unfortunately, his father didn't see things this way. To the king of the Oryx, there was no greater strength than to be king. This sort of philosophy thrust Elther to the forefront and created a tension between him as his eldest brothers. The favoritism his father showed couldn't have been more obvious. It didn't matter how much he said he only wanted to be a knight under their charge, it didn't seem to change anything. It was then he began to hear stories of the general. At first, It was just a small blip on their kingdom's radar. This wasn't the first time the people of the human kingdom had rebelled. But this time turned out to be different. 2 years later, it seemed that they might really fall. It was then that Elther finally learned of why his father placed so much hope in him, of why he was willing to risk ripping their family apart for the sake of pushing him to ascend the throne, of the fear that had gripped his father, his mountain of support, for so long. However, this fear that his father had buried deep within his heart for so long only showed Elther more of why he didn't want to be king. Burying such anxiousness within yourself, carrying the burden of hope for so many, being responsible for the lives and deaths of billions. He didn't want any of this. He just wanted to step onto the battlefield and fight to his heart's content, to let his strength quake the earth, shake the skies and sunder the stars. Today, though, Elther learned something that could make his eyes lock with resolve. In his pursuit of being that warrior, he had neglected something very important. If he wanted to be that deity of the battlefield, that existence who could make an opposing army quake with nothing more than a roar, he needed a banner to fly under, a might to grow beneath, a king to follow. His father wasn't that king, he was too eager to pass on his burdens. His brothers weren't that king either, they had already allowed jealousy to plague their relationship. It was obvious that they had no confidence in themselves. But the general, he somehow seemed incomplete as well. He was almost perfect in every aspect, but something subconsciously held him back from choosing him too. That said, Elther felt that by following a man who was so close to his ideal, he just might find that king he was looking for. 2 months. I can do that. Lionel dashed through the night, an incomparably calm expression on his face. In these 2 years, he had felt a certain anxiousness slowly leaving his body. He felt as though he was even calmer than he had been in the past. Much of this had to do with him learning of the existence of a 4th lineage factor lingering within his body. No, it was inaccurate to say that it was lingering. In fact, this lineage factor had been following him for the longest of the 4 he had. He had just never realized that it was indeed one. Even now, it was still mostly dormant. But Lionel felt that it was slowly awakening, as though a slumbering dragon shaking millennia of fatigue from his foggy eyes. Time continued to tick by. And soon a month had flown by. As promised, there wasn't any movement from the Oryx. However, Lionel hadn't breathed a word of his conversation with Elther to his lieutenants. Rather, they all focused on tightening the noose around the capital's neck. Every movement they made seemed to constrict the once mighty human kingdom. From above, one could almost see the image of a boa coiling its body around the capital. The more they struggled, the tighter the squeeze became. Waterways were blocked, supply routes were cut off, escape paths were destroyed. Every city was systematically conquered. It felt as though one was reading a textbook on military execution, rather than a telling of true events. As the rebel army descended and the 2nd month was quickly drawing to a close, the nobles began to truly feel the heat. Maybe it was because of the fear Alexander had instilled in them from the very beginning, but none of them had ever thought that things would reach this point. Or if they ever did, it still wouldn't be long before their awe-inspiring king flipped the tables with a casual move. Yet, even when the rebel army was bearing down on their gates, there was still no sign of movement. Were things really going to end like this for them? It was then the fateful day came. Lionel stood before the capital's tall walls with an army of tens of thousands to his back. He rose his spear into the air, his aura dignified and his momentum like an endless tidal wave. At that moment, as though they were all witnessing an act of God, it happened. Armageddon. Chapter 767. Chapter 767. 2 options. The earth rose high into the skies, forming boulders that were each 2 meters wide. It took time, but not long later, dozens had formed before erupting into a blaze of black-red flames. The searing heat alone seemed to want to melt the city to ash. Even without Lionel saying a word, the rebel army felt their blood boiling. There were no words of rage, none of fury or animosity. Even with this goal they had been working toward for years, praying for decades, there was still nothing that needed to be said. Actions spoke far louder than words ever could at this moment. This was indeed Armageddon. It was a judgment day for the capital, and its nobles who had had their foots on their throats for centuries. It was finally their turn to return the favor. The meteors descended toward the gate in a blaze of fire. Bang, 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 bang. The cacophonic booms resonated like drums of liberation. Walls that had stood tall for centuries came crumbling down. A gate which had never been opened to them incinerated to ash. A city they hadn't been deemed worthy to step foot into had suddenly been opened to them all. However, Lionel didn't give the order to charge. He continued to stand before the army, his chest wide, his back straight, his gaze cold and indifferent. At that moment, a figure suddenly began to appear out of the blazing fires as though they weren't there to begin with. When this figure became clearer, many began to look on with frowns on their faces. Truth be told, this man looked as though he had been living on the streets for several months. His clothes were beaten, ripped, dirted and ragged. His hair could only be described as a rat's nest, their natural blonde color discolored by what looked like and hopefully was mud. His eyes looked both groggy and lazy. Of all the things the rebel army expected to find when they came here, this was the last. The fact that there were no anti-siege tactics prepared by the capital was odd enough. It was even weirder that there hadn't been a single person atop the wall before their attack. And now there was this odd man? The man stumbled over the rocks before dropping down awkwardly before the carnage. He stretched his back in an exaggerated manner, as though he had spent far too long sitting. The crackles and pops that sounded from his action were so loud that they carried throughout the battlefield, even given the destruction to his back. This alone seemed to make those of the army take this man far more seriously. The man coughed, slinking his hair back and spitting at the ground before him. Somehow, a sword appeared in his hand. Despite the fact they had been observing him from beginning to end, no one had been able to pick up on its appearance. If it was as simple as a spatial ring, they obviously wouldn't react like this. But there was not a single spatial treasure on the man's body. It was as though the sword had really popped up from out of thin air. The man's action of sweeping his hair back revealed a devilishly handsome appearance. If he wasn't so dirty, he would truly be a lady killer. In fact, the fact they could think this at all could only mean that the dirt and grime that covered him couldn't possibly be as much of a deterrent as they thought. Blah blah, my name is Normand. Blah blah, your general is weak, he should fight me to prove his worth. Blah blah, not just anyone is worthy to fight my lovable bastard of a king. You get the gist of it, right? Hurry up, Mr. General, sir. The rebel army was speechless. Was this person issuing a challenge? Or were they acting out a comedy skit? What the hell was going on? Rollin, who sat on his horse not far from Lionel's back, also frowned. Challenges were rare on the battlefield, but not to the point that they never happened. But it was rare for the supposed stronger party to issue them. Usually, the point was to get a shot at taking out an important member of the opposing army with the least amount of hassle. It was also a good chance to lower the momentum and morale of an army. Still, challenges had to be issued by those of equivalent status. It was one thing if it was Alexander who had issued this challenge. But where had this homeless man come from? Who was he to challenge their general? However, surprisingly, Lionel held out a hand before Rollin could say anything. He simply walked forward, leaving the immediate protection of his army to stand in no man's land. Normand the Swift, I presume? Lionel asked. Gertrude's pupils constricted when she heard these words. Normand the Swift? He was a genius no lesser than the third prince of the Oryx kingdom. The only difference was that Normand was far older and had actually grown into his potential. But then years ago he suddenly vanished from the public eye and stopped appearing on battlefields altogether. Normand chuckled, still stretching his back. You didn't know, Mr. General, sir? I go by Normand the Cuck now. As you can see, my kingdom treats me great. But you, Mr. General, sir, are quite well informed. I'm surprised you've heard of such a title. I am quite informed. More than informed enough to recognize the actions of a useless king when I see it. Normand's gaze narrowed. In all these years, only he ever dared to say a word slandering Alexander. And even he often hid behind layers of sarcasm. Maybe due to an innate fear of what could happen to his former fiancée, he never truly went too far. But this general didn't seem to have any such qualms. I will give you two options, Normand. Though your hand is being forced, without first razing this city to the ground, there is nothing I can do for you. The first option is to step aside and either physically or spiritually join our effort. The second option is for you to die beneath my spear. Lionel had hardly finished his words when a sword light so swift it seemed to skirt reality appeared before his throat. Chapter 768. Chapter 768, Pure Speedster Clang. The polearm of Lionel's spear appeared before him vertically, blocking the pierce of Normand's swift sword. It was such a precise block that the sword didn't slip one direction or another. It simply trembled in place, unable to move forward any longer. What a coincidence! Normand said, his voice sounding particularly flat, all of his playfulness and sarcasm vanishing. I've been looking to die for a long time already. Lionel's eyes narrowed. His spear shifted forward, the tip of Normand's sword to get caught in one of the hollow grooves of his long, flexible spear. Normand suddenly experienced his sword being twisted as Lionel's spear spun to the side. The pressure bore down on his wrist, threatening to break it entirely. But it was at that exact moment that Normand left his feet, his body spinning in the air along with his sword. Lionel's pupils constricted. Weightless, he didn't get to dwell on the thought for very long before Normand swiftly pulled his sword back, piercing forward again with a speed even greater than the first time. He seemed to have no need of his swift title at all. His actions existed on a plane all to their own. Lionel took a calm step back, the spin of his spear picking up as he blocked its pierce precisely. He controlled the speed with such accuracy and precision that even when Normand tried to aim for the gaps, he would always find Lionel's polearm waiting. Normand pulled his sword back, his lazy eyes seemingly becoming even more lazy. His body loosened, his limbs becoming flexible to an extreme. He seemed to fall toward the ground. But when his leg pounded against the dirt below, a crack spread out instantaneously, even reaching back toward the collapsing city wall to his back, and forcing it to fall even faster. His speed was so blazingly fast that Lionel's eyes couldn't keep up no matter how hard they tried. He became nothing more than a slight ripple of wind. Yet it still felt that his body was still accelerating. Lionel coldly watched on, his spear moving in a blur of its own. Clashes sounded throughout the battlefield. One man stood almost unmoving. Even when he did, it would be to take a slight pivot in a given direction. His foundation was as steady as a mountain, a singular strike of his seemingly blocking many from his opponent. The other was nothing more than a blur. Over 90% of the battlefield couldn't even follow him movements, while another 10% could only barely catch a glimpse of him the instant his sword clashed with Lionel, and he was forced to slow for just a moment. This ratio wasn't much different even among those watching from the royal court. They all wore somber expressions, watching from the castle. Somehow, the one man they had hated for so long had become the one man they hoped would save them all. Lionel's spear suddenly descended with a fierce light, sending Normand skipping backward. So it's like that. Lionel nodded to himself. He's a speedster. The speedster ability index had many categories just like any other ability. There were some speedsters that relied on the wind, light or lightning elements. But pure speedsters like Normand were quite rare. He wasn't relying on an element. He was using nothing more than his bodily talent. As odd as it might sound, such pure speedsters were monstrous talents no less sought after than a genius with a deep space or even time affinity. The speedster ability index was broken down simply: speed, weightless, acceleration, control, and warp. Speed was the simplest. It allowed one to break the Bodis limits and display an uncommon pace. Weightless is where the true strength of pure speedsters began to show. This state allowed the freedom of the body to unlock. Maneuvers like the one Normand had pulled earlier occurred as easily as him thinking it. Acceleration built upon weightless. This allowed a pure speedster to ramp up to the greatest speed far quicker, and at the highest level, allowed it to be near instantaneous. This allowed a pure speedster to both save on the stamina they would normally need to hit their top speed, and also allowed them more flexibility in using their ability in battle. Once reaching control, both weightless and acceleration were built up. At this level, one gained an inhuman amount of agility, stopping from speeds far surpassing the pace of sound on a dime, and turning to a completely new direction without putting any sort of pressure on your body would become as easy as breathing. This was something that elemental speedsters would never be able to accomplish. Control also allowed Onto to turn speed into power with the highest level of efficiency. This level made pure strength types look like nothing more than a joke. And then, there was warp. At this highest level, a pure speedster could bend light, space and at the pinnacle even time to their whim. Such an existence was beyond reproach, nigh untouchable. At Norman's level, Lionel was absolutely certain that he was at the 3-star acceleration stage. And that was despite still being a mere Tier 3 expert, and likely not having the opportunity to train in over a decade. If he used his title, Norman finally appeared once again, his head shaking. He had no idea how these fools expected him to display any true strength after spending so much of the past dozen years in a cell. However, this was a beautiful irony to him. He would definitely go all out. He would pour his blood, sweat and tears into this battle, not just for the sake of hoping to save the love of his life a small bit of hardship, but also so that they could regret it. Regret what could have been. Regret what they had done to him from the depths of their souls. He wanted the general to crush him at his very best. He wanted to fall beneath that mighty spear while they knew full well he had done all he could. Then, he wanted this kingdom to fall to its knees before the same blade. Norman suddenly began to laugh into the skies, his aura blazing. I am a titled knight of His Majesty Alexander the Apex. I am Norman the Swift. The wind calls me brother. The light calls me friend. The gods try to strike me down, but my speed is eternal. Eternal. Chapter 769. Chapter 769. Why? A pillar of golden light descended from the skies and seemed to blind the entirety of the battlefield. Norman's roar shook the capital, his conviction splitting the clouds in the sky apart and causing a fissure that divided the two opposing forces. When he reappeared, it seemed as though he had been completely reformed. His body was flooded with a white gold light, making it look as though he was wearing robes. His golden hair had been completely cleansed and his emerald eyes shone like two true gems. As though his form had become ethereal, he seemed as light as a wisp of smoke and as fleeting as a fragrance in the wind. Then he moved. Lionel's pupils constricted. He circulated golden feather step, causing two massive wings to appear toward his back. Their white gold appearance was no less dazzling, especially as each feather became more and more defined. However, they had hardly formed when Norman had already appeared before him. It was as though it had only taken him a single flicker, a small twitch of the muscle, a minute in tension, for him to suddenly cross a distance of hundreds of meters. Like a streaking light, his sword struck forward, its speed so fast and its pattern so all-encompassing that a singular thin blade almost formed a curtain all to its own. Lionel frowned. Grand bell construct. Ding, 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 ding. Instantaneously, an illusory bronze bell appeared before Lionel, his casting speed having reached ungodly levels. However, before he could take advantage of the spell's construction to attack while he was being protected, his pupils constricted. In the blink of an eye, Norman's sword lights doubled. In an instant, Grand Bell Construct's defensive limit was reached and a rain of piercing swords surged toward Lionel's vital points. Brandishing his spear, Lionel accelerated backward, a single flap of his enormous semi-illusory wings taking him dozens of meters with ease. Yet, as though Norman was nothing more than his shadow, he pressed his advantage. It seemed to take not a single ounce of effort to keep up. His body draped in an endless white gold that streaked to infinity toward his back. Lionel's eyes couldn't keep up with him even if they tried. But his internal sight could see Norman's face almost as clearly as if he was standing perfectly still. The red eyes, the gritted teeth, the streaming tears. The first opened a window to a man on the brink of madness. The second was so fierce that it drew blood, causing crimson to drip down his chin and be whipped away by the wind. The last sparkled beneath the golden light, carrying a beauty with it that it had no right to have. Lionel's jaw set. Every fiber of his being did not want to kill this man. Anyone with even the slightest shred of sympathy wouldn't want to do such a thing. Emotions dictated that he should find a way, that he should climb through a mountain of corpses to save this man he had only just met today. It was a silly, meaningless nicety, especially when he knew very clearly that this was a person who wanted nothing more than to die. However, logic told him a single life wasn't worth how many he would sacrifice by taking such a route. Wasn't that how he had dictated his life until this point? The reason he hated killing so much was because he didn't feel that his own life was worth any more than another's. So how could he on one hand believe that, then on the other, feel so torn in this moment? Norman roared, his call feeling like the maddened wail of a wounded beast. His shout spread throughout the capital as he pushed himself to his very limits. Lionel could see it all. The blood that fell from his eyes. How his bulging thighs tore streaks of flesh away from his legs. He could even sense his heart pumping past its limits, causing micro-tears to appear one after another. He wasn't just going all out. He was going beyond his means for just one goal: to kill Lionel. A deep breath seemed to silence the entire battlefield. Lionel could no longer hear a thing. He couldn't feel the collapsing walls of the city. He couldn't sense the crunching ground beneath his feet or the shouts of his men. He could hardly even hear the beating of his own heart. He closed his eyes, the flow of his blood reaching a crawl. Why did everything always have to be such a burden? Why did every choice he had to make come with such a dull pain? Why did he live in a world where he had to make such choices to begin with? Lionel's focus reached an extreme height. Beneath his thinking speed, even Norman's blazing speed seemed as slow to a snail's crawl. He felt that he could accomplish days of thinking in just a few seconds. And so, he sighed. The world sped back up, Norman's blazing pace starting to leave sparkling motes of red as his blood vaporized into the air. His muscle fibers tore apart one after another, but his roar seemed endless, bellowing into the skies above. At that moment, Lionel lightly tapped his foot. On a piece of ground to his back, a small patch of earth no more than 3 inches across rose a half centimeter up. In the blink of an eye, he had already crossed this distance. However, Norman couldn't react to the change. No, maybe he never saw it to begin with. Chasing after Lionel, his entire focus on piercing his throat. How could Norman realize that such a small change had occurred on the ground? So he tripped. He fell forward at blazing speeds, his body losing all of its coordination in an instant. It was just a small moment. Having stepped into control with the help of his title, coupled with his deep comprehension of weightless, it wasn't more than a microsecond. Yet, it was in that second that he suddenly found a spear plunge through his chest, shattering his heart into an eruption of crimson flesh. Chapter 770. Chapter 770. Eternal Norman crashed into Lionel's body, impaling himself further. However, Lionel didn't move an inch. As though a steady mountain that had stood since an ancient era, he remained unmoving even as Norman's chin fell over his shoulder. Norman sputtered, his mouth, already leaking with blood, suddenly beginning to flow with it. The tears that fell down his face only seemed to make the crimson stream down faster, sapping away the heaviness of his life's blood, and washing it away as though it was meaningless. A light chuckle left Norman's lips, his raised sword slowly falling to the side. He no longer had the strength to hold it up. Even now, the only reason he could continue to stand on his feet was because of Lionel's spear and shoulder. How pathetic. He coughed violently, shards of flesh flying from his mouth and coating Lionel's back as though to mark him for a lifetime. Norman the Swift. Lost because I tripped. He found it hysterical. He could see through the difficulty in doing such a thing to him. The location of the change to the earth had to be precisely chosen. It had to be well hidden, and it had to be perfectly timed. At the speed he was going at, his feet hardly touched the ground even once in tens of meters, and the intervals weren't even evenly spaced. Depending on the attacks he chose, the acceleration or deceleration he could choose mid-combat, any number of changes could occur. At his speed, any one of those changes could cause deviations of several meters. Yet, Lionel still chose the precise point where his toes would strike the ground, causing the greatest amount of devastation to him. He understood all of this well. To be a pure speedster, he had to have a thinking speed that could keep up with his legs. However, he still found it all to be hysterical. If he had the energy to laugh into the skies, he would do it. Norman's mouth sputtered with another mouthful of blood, this time completely drenching Lionel's back through. "Thanks for the battle," he said softly. His eyes dimmed, his body going completely limp. Lionel stood in silence for a long while, his spear still running through Norman's body, the latter's chin still resting on his shoulder. He couldn't see it now, but he could feel it. He could feel the light smile on Norman's face, that satisfied upturn of his lip, that peaceful dimming of his eyes. It was the look of a man who had finally died on his own terms. Not in a cell surrounded by rotting mold or scurrying rats, but on the battlefield fighting with all he had. Silence rang over the battlefield. There wasn't a single hint of the cheering one would expect to hear after a successfully won challenge. None of the pride, none of the adulation. There was only a brewing heaviness, an unwillingness that radiated outward in the sinking of their heartbeats. I was Norman the Swift. The wind called me brother. The light called me friend. The gods tried to strike me down. But my speed is eternal, eternal. Lionel's spear vanished as he slowly lowered Norman to the ground. Kneeling to his side, he closed the lids of his eyes with 2 fingers, uncaring as the tips of his hands were drenched through with blood. Lionel's head slowly turned to the sky above the castle in the distance. There was a man who stood amidst the clouds. His black hair, dotted with strands of gray, was immaculately well-kempt. Even as it shifted in the wind, whether it was his short hair or his partially graying beard, not a single strand seemed to leave its preordained spot. He had long, flowing imperial robes wrapped in the body of a golden dragon. His crown sat upon his head, completely straight. It seemed to connect him to the skies above, even as his robes fluttered and his hair shifted. This was the one constant that never seemed to change. Looking down on the world, he seemed indifferent to it all, as though a passive observer rather than the king of a nation that had lost almost all his land. He didn't seem angry, nor saddened, nor even somber. If one didn't know better, one would think that he was a deity, observing the work of his creation as though it was passive, middling entertainment rather than the lives and hard labor of real people. His demeanor was worse than any debasing snicker, any snide remark, any cruel chortle. Lionel looked back down to Norman's corpse. Even now, his lip was curled into that very smile Lionel had imagined. He was unmoved by the supposed apex. Rising to his feet, Lionel's palm flipped over, a glistening, double-bladed, silver spear appearing in his hands. The moment it did, for once it seemed to be completely docile. It didn't move or rattle. It didn't fight back against Lionel's control. It didn't throw a tantrum. It was as though it could feel that if it pissed Lionel off now, it would never see the light of day again. Lionel's steps didn't make a single sound. In fact, they were as light as a feather, as soft as a gentle breeze. And yet, every one resonated with the beating of their hearts. As light as they were, they only seemed to grow heavier. There were no piles of rubble, no tall fires, no single warrior that could stop his path forward. As though he had decided that he would go straight ahead from the very beginning, he didn't deviate an inch from that path. He stared toward that man in the skies, his gaze expressionless. Lionel's foot rose as he stepped into the city. When it descended, bang! Massive stones of earth jetted out from his back, shattering the ground beneath his feet as he shot into the air. There was nothing in this world that he wanted more than the death of this man. The crown of a king. He didn't deserve it. Chapter 771. In a location barely 10 miles from the capital, Elther sat on the ground, his face swollen with bruises and his lip dripping with a small bit of blood. It was clear that someone had roughed him up, but not to the point of leaving any lasting injuries. In fact, even though he had a cold look in his eyes at that moment, it didn't seem to be a real rage. Rather, it was more of a dissatisfaction. Other than his partially swollen face, his clothing was in rags and his arms were chained behind his back. He sat in the dirt, not looking toward any specific direction despite the fact that several individuals were standing above him. It was as though he couldn't hear their rage at all. Of these people, two were particularly pissed off. Just with a simple look, one could see that they bore some resemblance to Elther, although they weren't quite as handsome. By now, their faces had gone red from fury and their throats hurt from yelling. But it only made it worse that Elther didn't respond no matter what it was that they said. He simply sat there unmoving. He had already succeeded in his goal. The capital was definitely being attacked right now, and whether they won or lost would be in Lionel's hands. As for the rage of his family, so what? He only did what he thought was right. At that moment, the ground suddenly split. A silence fell as they moved out of the way one after another. Even the two men who bore a resemblance to Elther fell into silence, moving out of the way. In the presence of this man, they didn't dare to say a word. Elther felt a shadow cast over his body. For the first time he looked up. But what he saw made his pupils tremble. The man that stood above him was none other than his own father, the king of the Oryx. Somehow, at that moment, his wrinkles seemed far deeper than they had been, as though he had aged 10 years in the span of just a few moments. He was a man of tall stature, his hair completely wizened with white. His robes were plain, and he didn't wear a crown, but he had a dignified momentum that forced those around him into silence. He had a forceful, sort of square face. Compared to Elther, his horns were far larger, branching out almost like the canopies of a large, ancient tree. Even though his eyes were somewhat murky with age, they hid a sharpness that seemed capable of piercing through his son's soul. He didn't say a word for a long time. He only continued to observe his son. For the first time, Elther didn't see love, adoration or hope. He saw a deep-rooted disappointment that made his heart tremble and his eyes water. His father didn't have to speak for him to suddenly feel a weight he had never experienced in his life before. In that moment, for some reason, he felt that burden a king carried. Why? The Oryx King's voice was calm and soothing. It carried a silky quality one could listen to for a lifetime without becoming tired. It was hard to tell if this was simply natural, or if it was a cadence he had learned from years of ruling. Elther's jaw trembled before he clenched his teeth. Due to his blatantly false information, the Oryx armies had ended up in the wrong location, too far from the battle to make it in time. It would be one thing if they were only sending a few people, but to lead such a large army, it would take too much time. Before they got there, much of the result would be set in stone. Plus, their original goal wasn't to fight for or against anyone. They simply didn't want the rebel army to attack the capital. Anything else they did didn't matter. However, it was obviously too late to change anything now. I didn't agree with your orders, Elther finally said as firmly as he could. So instead of following them, you chose to place all your people at risk instead? The Oryx King continued calmly. Do you understand how many will die when this plan of yours fails? Do you believe that this is something a king should do? Elther snapped. I never wanted to be king. His breath came out harsh and hurried. He was tired of hearing the same bullshit day in and day out. This was never something he had wanted, so why were things always being framed like this to make him out to be some sort of failure? The king of the Oryx didn't even flinch at his son's outburst. His breathing remained steady, his gaze unmoved, his mood unchanged. Even after all these years, you still do not understand. Being king is not about what you want. Elther wanted to yell again, but his father's soothing voice spoke again before he could, making him feel as though he was choking on air. Becoming king is also not about what you want. The Oryx King continued to gaze at his son. A kingship is a burden. It presses on your shoulders, it bends your back, it weighs on your heart and soul. You do not become a king by wanting. You become one by circumstance. Those who cannot feel this burden, even worse, those who chase after it, lusting after it, pleading for it, these are not men fit to rule. Elther's two brothers looked to the ground. For some reason, they felt a pang in their hearts, their expressions becoming overcast by hints of shame they couldn't hide despite the best of their efforts. Elther himself trembled fiercely, his eyes watering outside of his control. He couldn't find the words in him to rebuttal. Everard. Richet. My king. Both generals spoke in unison, their voices booming. Today we ride to battle. Father. Elther called out, sensing that something was wrong. The king no longer looked toward his son. From this day forth, Elthur Yumrake will be the 57th king of our Oryx kingdom. Ensure that the ceremony is grand and his name resonates with the heavens. This king will watch on from the other side. The Oryx king leapt onto his tall, black steed, his back straight and his halberd appearing in his hand. To his left and right, Everard and Richet sat just as tall, their expressions determined. Then they charged into the distance, carving a straight line toward the capital. Chapter 772. Let me go. I said let me go. Elthur fought with all his might. But, compared to the generals that remained and just how many of them there were, Elthur was just a young boy without a chance. With so many restraining him at once, he had no chance of breaking through. Rage lit his features, his body breaking into his battle form, and even shattering the chains that held him down. But even this wasn't enough. It only made the strikes he suffered even heavier. The Oryx were never a light-handed race. Even knowing that this was their new king, they didn't hold back. They refused to allow him to charge off into a battle that meant nothing but death. He was their future, their light and their hope. If they ever wanted a chance to avenge their king, they needed him to grow and mature. Or else their kingdom wouldn't last very much longer. Even as they pummeled their young king into the ground, their fists heavy, tears streamed down their faces in an endless torrent. Not a single one of them looked toward their king's back receding into the distance. But they all knew that this was the last time they would see him. Elthur collapsed onto the ground, his bones beaten and broken. He couldn't stand even if he wanted to. It felt as though every inch of his body had suffered a severe injury other than his organs themselves. However, somehow he still found the strength to pound the ground with his fists, his wails spreading through the entire Oryx army. He's a king. I'm the warrior. I should be on the front line. Not him. Not him. The ground cracked, splintered and cratered beneath his strength, his pupils darkening the more rage he felt. All around, the upper echelon of the Oryx kingdom stood. The only sound for miles seemed to be the cries of their young king. Lionel felt his arms almost shatter the instant he made contact. His leverage in the air wasn't the best to begin with since he had to rely on a piece of earth floating beneath his feet, but he had a feeling that even if he had such leverage, it wouldn't make much of a difference. Alexander was immovable. His palm stopped the blade of his quasi-silver spear, as though it was any ordinary weapon. The forces of repulsion almost blasted Lionel back to the ground. At least, it seemed like it was just almost. Until the piece of earth beneath his feet shattered, and he was sent careening into the city below as though a falling meteor. The air shot out of Lionel's body. In these years he hadn't managed to progress past the Tier 4 stage of his fourth-dimensional metal body, because he couldn't find the specific ores he needed in this place. However, this didn't mean that his body wasn't obscenely sturdy. Even though he didn't cough up blood, though his inner organs were rattled. Falling from almost 30 meters in the air like that was tough even for him. Yet, Lionel shot out in the next instant, appearing in the skies again with a whole barrage of broken stone and earth following behind him. Lionel unleashed a flurry of attacks, the tip of his spear exploding with flames as bombs of fire erupted in the skies. Alexander calmly glided backward, navigating through the earthen projectiles flying toward him at astonishing speed as though he was skating on ice. Every time he lightly pressed his palm forward, Lionel's attacks would be rebuffed as though meeting an impenetrable wall. The attacks almost seemed to be nullified completely, and none of the strength even traveled to the other parts of Alexander's body. A defensive type ability? Is it just his palm? Or is it his whole body? Lionel's white gold wings appeared once more, his body erupting as bronze runes surged throughout his skin. A violet red colored his eyes as his strength exploded. He hopped from floating rock to floating rock, his speed growing faster and faster. Harmonic spear. At that moment, Lionel's body was suddenly cloned, each of them seemingly leaving afterimages in the air. In the blink of an eye, he looked to be everywhere at once, both being a long distance from Alexander and a short distance at the same time. Alexander's eyes narrowed. Spears descended toward him from all directions. Just when it seemed that he would be skewered, His force surged. Bang! All the images dissipated at once, leaving just one Lionel piercing toward Alexander's back. However, rather than the image of him being run through that many might have expected, a spherical shield had appeared all around Alexander, making Lionel's arms rattle. There was just a slight pause before Lionel found himself being shot out once again. Like a ball out of a cannon, he crashed through the city, bounding through walls and the stone-tiled grounds. Lionel coughed, shaking his head. Looking up into the skies, he saw Alexander looking toward him with an indifferent expression. So it is a defense ability fueled by world force. No wonder even my quasi-silver spear can't break his defenses. His ability is probably equivalent to a sixth-dimensional one with the support of his world force. And unlike his titled knights, he doesn't have to call out his title. But Goggles said that this Alexander had an ability related to words. Was that wrong? Or am I missing something? Lionel slowly stood, his expression indifferent. It was as though he wasn't the one who had just suffered such a loss. It seems it's time for you to make your debut. Lionel pierced his spear into the ground, his momentum growing fiercer as force whistled around him. At that moment, the halo above his head began to glow fiercely, expanding a fold in size as it continued to tremble. Then it grew another fold, then another. Eventually, the halo was over 2 meters in diameter alone, shining such a bright bronze violet that it almost looked like a violet gold. When it reached its peak, it descended over Lionel's body, reaching his feet in a single bound. Nothing seemed to have happened. But as it rose back over Lionel's body, a brilliant armor began to appear. Chapter 773. The whipping winds came to a grinding halt. Beaming sunlight reflected off of the plates of armor. Bright silvers and delicate blacks alternated along its elaborate patterns. Just its presence alone seemed to make time itself stop, an eerie stillness hanging all around it. As the halo passed over Lionel's head, it was slowly covered by a helmet, sealing away his handsome, indifferent features. A light clicking locked everything into space. As though it had come alive, the armor shrunk a size, clinging to Lionel's armor as though it was nothing more than a second skin. This was the true ability of divine armor. It didn't function like a normal armor would. For all intents and purposes, it had become a living, breathing part of Lionel's body. When it was damaged, it would be repaired. When it moved, it would have a flexibility other armors couldn't match. Its power was now Lionel's own, its presence Lionel's presence. Lionel ripped his spear out from the ground, the world quaking beneath his benign action. White gold wings spread along Lionel's back once more. The contrast between his silver-black armor and them seemed to dazzle the world. However, whatever absent-mindedness one could have had vanished when Lionel suddenly shot forward. In a blink, he was already above Alexander. Without any aid, he stepped into the air as though it was as easy as breathing, his spear descending with such forcefulness that one would have thought that his goal was to split the planet below rather than the man before him. Alexander's pupils constricted. He was able to fly not because of an ability, but because of world force which granted him such a strength. This was the first time he had seen someone who shouldn't have a flying ability do so. None of the reports he had received ever mentioned this armor, nor did any mention his ability to fly. It was clear that this was a trump card that Lionel had left hidden just for this exact moment. Alexander reacted quickly, his palm shooting outward toward Lionel's blade just as it always had. But in that moment, he suddenly felt as though his hand was moving through a wall of wind or a depth of quicksand. It slowed considerably even though he felt it was moving just as fast as it originally was. The cognitive dissonance threw him for a loop. However, it was then an alarming sense of danger shook him to his core. Without hesitation, he shot backward. Lionel's spear descended. In one moment, it was before Alexander's palm. But in an act that could only be said to break the laws of reality, it appeared past it in the next instant. It didn't even seem to have teleported. Somehow, it felt that it had always been there. Alexander's dodge came just in time, but he was too late to stop his kingly robes from being torn in two, a shallow line of blood running down his chest. Alexander's acceleration met the same muddy pastures. It was as though he was locked down from all sides. No matter where he moved, how he moved, or how much effort he put into it, it felt as though his speed had been cut down drastically. The sight of the apex suddenly finding himself on a back foot left those watching stunned. To a degree, these even included those of the rebel army. But very soon, they began to roar at the top of their lungs, emotions they had been bottling up for decades bubbling forth. Lionel's spear spun in his hands. Through the air, he took slow and deliberate steps forward, bearing down on Alexander. His spear lashed out, splitting into two of its three parts. The blade shot forward like an arrow, completely unaffected by the same slow in speed Alexander was. In fact, it seemed to have become even faster than it would be normally. Alexander put up his barrier once more. The only way he had managed to keep his head all this time was by protecting his body from all sides like this. However, just when he was expecting the blade to pierce at his chest, it vanished, a massive pressure slicing into the shield to his back. The sight left the nobles in horror. By now they were absolutely certain. It was a spatial ability, and a devastating one at that. Lionel's chain snapped back into place, but in one fluid motion, he spun the opposing side forward, sending another chain snaking forth. What began as a slow, methodical approach became a torrential assault in the blink of an eye. The sound of snapping and retracting chains rang through the battlefield. Shadows of gray and silver whipping about as Lionel practically used the supposed king for target practice. Alexander's expression darkened. As though he was hiding in a turtle shell, he could only take the endless barrage, the sound of clanging metal ringing in his ears endlessly. Looking at the armored figure standing in the skies even above him, his heart filled with intent to murder. It had been a very long time since someone truly thought to test his sovereignty. He had never really counted Normand. In his eyes, such a man was nothing more than a rat struggling on his very last breath. A rodent caught in a trap without even the slightest chance to escape. However, this was very different. This sort of assault on his rulership was unprecedented. He was Alexander the Apex. This world was nothing more than a stepping stone to him. There would come a day where he ruled this universe, and would become the true apex of all. Alexander roared, what remained of his robe shattering to reveal a powerful and toned torso. The singular line of red running down it quickly healed, a large pillar of light descending from the skies. At that moment he truly evoked his apex title, his strength soaring. He tore a trail forward through Lionel's domain, his palms squeezing into fists. With a single punch forward, a golden fist appeared in the skies. It felt as though the world might collapse at any moment. Chapter 774. Lionel's cold and calculating eyes watched as this golden fist bore down on him. As though it was still being constantly fueled by the energies of the world, it continued to expand in size. From matching Alexander's fist, it was soon larger than even Lionel's body, wanting to crush him into minced meat. Lionel didn't seem to realize that this fist was meant for him. He remained unmoving, his spear being held between his fingers and thumb as though it was as light as a feather. In his mind, thoughts of Normand continued to surface. The pain of the commoners, the nightmare of the nobles. All the pains and atrocities this man had committed in the name of maintaining his power and strength. Lionel found that there were too many people like this in the world. It was just that not all of them had the power Alexander had. It was as though a cancer had been brewing in the dimensional verse for millennia, but not a single person had been able to do a thing about it. Those that were at the bottom simply suffered in silence. Those at the top perpetuated it to hold on to their power. Those that managed to raise up from the former and enter the ranks of the latter believed that their hard work gave them the right to do as they pleased. Maybe the third group of people was the worst. They had perspectives on both sides, and yet they chose to maintain the status quo, saying garbage like those at the bottom should just work harder, as though they had a monopoly on what it meant to put in effort. Such people completely forgot about what help they might have received, what luck they might have stumbled into, what aid someone else had given them. Once they succeeded, nothing else mattered to them than to make sure others knew they reached their goals while you didn't, because you didn't work hard enough. And then there was this Alexander. He was already at the top of this world, But Lionel could see the ambition in his eye. It couldn't have been more obvious. This king had already been lucky, being born into royalty in the first place. Now whatever card he had up his sleeve that made him so confident that he could face the whole of the dimensional verse. Do you think that he felt he was lucky to stumble into such an opportunity too? No. He probably thought that he was destined for such a fate. That it was his hard work that put him in position to benefit from such a boon. That he deserved it. It all sickened Lionel to the very pits of his stomach. Why was it that he never thought his life was more valuable than another's? Wasn't it obvious that he was worth more? Just look at his talent. Just look at his strength. Him dying wasn't the same as another dying. How could it be? But this was never how Lionel had seen it. Why did his talent give him more worth than someone else? He had been lucky to be born to a father from the seventh dimension. He had been lucky to be born to a talented mother who could catch such a man's eye. He was lucky to have a grandmother from a sixth-dimensional family, lucky to have a grandfather who ruled a world with eighth-dimensional potential. What had he done to deserve any of this? He won a lottery. That was all it was. He hadn't earned anything. And neither did this false king before him. Such trash with an overinflated sense of worth. All because they were born with a golden spoon in their mouths. Lionel hated them all. In the past, he hadn't been able to put his thoughts together so clearly, to understand what it is that sickened him so much with such clarity. But he understood now. If there was anything that could change the world, it would be reliant on those at the bottom to rise up. It would require those who understood the plight of those lesser than them. Those were deemed lucky enough to win the dimensional versus lottery, who would have to choose to do something. So right here and now, in this world, Lionel chose to do something. A dense black energy coated Lionel's spear. Its presence alone made space quake, the fabric of reality threatening to tear apart. He rose his arm into the skies. When it descended, silence reigned. Alexander's roar coming to a deathly silence. A scythe of spatial elemental force tore through the air, splintering the massive golden fist in two as though it was deflating a balloon. Lionel took a step forward, his body vanishing only to appear before Alexander. The apex? The greatest speed. The greatest strength. The greatest power. But who cared? That was only the apex in this false king's small world view. Lionel would show him the view of a person far luckier than he was. He would show him an apex above his. Die. Lionel said coldly. Alexander shot a fist forward, still believing in his barrier. But at that moment, Lionel's blade vanished. When it reappeared, it had already crossed Alexander's defenses, appearing above his collar. Before Alexander could even react, the blade had already cut into the traps of his shoulders, slicing his body across diagonally. Blood rained through the sky, Alexander's two halves flying through the air past Lionel, without the ability to stop their momentum. But, as all things, this too eventually came to an end. With Alexander's eyes dimming, his body lost any strength it had, falling through the skies in a shower of crimson. Blood droplets hung around Lionel, completely unable to touch his body. They fell down one after another, bathing the capital in the life of their false king. The cheering of the rebel army came to a grinding halt. Had they done it? Had they really succeeded? Were their years of suffering finally over? Hot tears fell down their cheeks, falling to the lands that were now their own. Lionel stood in the skies, his armor glistening, his spear point relaxed. He looked up into the skies, a light smile hidden beneath his helmet. But it was at that exact moment that his pupils constricted. His head whipped in the direction of Alexander's corpse, his expression frosting over. A deep cackle filled the air, the manic laughter plunging the temperature of the capital down by dozens of degrees. Chapter 775. The laughter held a madness that could only fill one with a sense of apprehension and fear. It was the kind of laughter that came from a man who had lost his mind, the kind only one who had stepped over their breaking point could produce. The two halves of Alexander's body began to stitch itself back together. As though it was a mere surface stitching, as he tried to rise up, his body threatened to fall apart again. However, slowly but surely, the connection became steadier and stronger. By the time Alexander had risen to his feet, the stitching began to mend itself, disappearing beneath healthy, healed skin. In the skies, Lionel watched on with narrowed eyes. He was trying to understand if he had made a mistake or not. Where had he gone wrong? What exactly was this ability? Where did it come from? Was this another ability of world force? Did Alexander's apex title give him superior healing? Now that Lionel thought about it, he had already injured Alexander once before in this battle. And though it had been an exceptionally shallow wound, it had also healed very quickly. Or could it possibly be something else entirely? Something he had no idea about? At this moment, the inconvenience of the dictionary shone through. He was certain that his father had done it on purpose. He didn't believe for a moment that his father didn't have the skill to make the dictionary more convenient to use. Even the people of Earth could make microchips the size of a single cell, let alone what his father would be capable of. Lionel could feel a great and suffocating aura coming from Alexander. At that moment, he didn't dare to take out the dictionary. He primed his entire body to be prepared for battle, and could only think about this himself. Lionel's jaw set as Alexander's manic laughter only grew more pompous. Nothing about Alexander's actions made sense. If he had such power, why is it that he would allow things to reach this point? If he didn't have such power, and this was nothing more than a facade, why was he wasting time laughing like this? All signs pointed toward this man having fallen into madness, but why did Lionel feel a cold, murderous and calculating intent constantly locked onto him? The feeling was both chilling and sticky, as though ice stuck to his skin was being forcibly peeled off. It was then that Lionel saw Alexander's eyes. With a single look, he understood where this feeling was coming from. Alexander's mouth was peeled open, his laughter ringing out to the point Lionel could even see his tongue vibrating. However, none of it seemed to reach his eyes. His irises were drenched in a cold fury, as though his laughter was out of humiliation rather than humor. It was exactly at that moment that Alexander's aura shattered and reformed itself. His entire being seemed to transcend. Lionel's pupils constricted. Fifth dimension. Nothing seemed to make any sense anymore. This was supposed to be a quasi-bronze zone. How could a fifth-dimensional threat appear here? Was it a unique zone? But where was the outside interference? Lionel had done too much research, too much due diligence in the past 2 years to have possibly missed an outside influence. He would have noticed it long ago. That he was absolutely certain of. This aside, even if there was going to be an outside interference, they would have had to take some sort of action in order to cause this zone to evolve. But where had this action been taken? Lionel hadn't sensed any outside forces, no foreign energies, not even an unexpected change to the battlefield. On top of all of this, this was supposed to be a variant zone. The fact that Lionel had had to slave away for 2 years, and still hadn't seen any sort of reward yet was already outside the norm. So how could this also happen as well? It couldn't be that all the variables had piled up to the point things reached this level of unpredictability? Was it even possible for him to fight a person on such a level? Before Lionel could even think about it any longer, he found that Alexander had appeared before him. A fist that felt like it could collapse worlds drew closer, swimming through a sea of dense spatial force with a speed that felt like it should be impossible. Lionel dodged to the side, barely using his divine armor's warped domain to leave unharmed. However, he instantly felt the drain, his body feeling like a fish out of water. Fueling his divine armor to slow the movement of a fourth-dimensional existence was one matter. But, to try to do that same against a fifth-dimensional existence was almost a fool's dream. Alexander stood in the air where Lionel had been, not moving an inch as the latter rose higher into the skies and made some distance between them. He seemed quite shocked that his blow hadn't landed. His manic laughter seemed to still hang in the skies, echoing through the slowly accumulating and graying clouds. He rolled his shoulder, seemingly stretching it out or getting used to his new strength. After a moment, he clenched his fist, causing all sorts of energies to begin rolling in from all sides. First it was world force. Then Lionel sensed universal force. Then there came a neutral force. The three together caused the space around Alexander to quake as the images of 4 dark seasons began to form around his body. The skies quaked, a rumbling, low growl of thunder accumulating momentum. In that moment, a single drop of rain rebounded off of Lionel's armor. To him, it almost sounded like a pin drop. And yet, it resonated through his mind like the roar of a lion, resonating through his armor with impunity. Then, Alexander's fist shot forward again. Chapter 776. Lionel roared, his spear vibrating with large amounts of spatial force as he met this golden fist. Sparks flew, what looked like arcs of black lightning contrasting against a sparkling gold. Lionel was continuously pushed back, his anchor in the sky and his strength not being nearly enough. Just to fly, he had to use the spatial force around him to his advantage. But after just a single exchange with Alexander, it felt as though he could hardly bring forth this strength anymore. Just as Lionel was struggling with just a single one, Alexander appeared in the skies above him, his fist sending out a second strike. Lionel's pupils constricted, his arms trembling as he fought back. But whatever small leverage he had had facing one completely collapsed in the face of the second. Without suspense, his body practically crumpled, his armor threatening to shatter beneath the might of the two strikes. Bang! Lionel's body was forcefully tunneled into the ground, two fist imprints layering over one another to drive him further and further into the dirt. A silence hung over the battlefield as the small drizzles of rain became more frequent, picking up momentum until a constant rattle rang in all of their ears. Lionel shot out from the ground, his armor looking as pristine as when he first produced it. And yet, the state of his inner organs told a completely different tale. If it wasn't for his metal body and divine armor working as one, he might have been half dead already. But even then, he already found it difficult to stand. Lionel took deep breaths, his gaze locking onto Alexander and his grip holding on tightly to his silver, double-bladed spear. Dreamscape battle sense. A strong dream force suddenly swept over the battlefield, as though a scanner sweeping a probe. Everything was reflected in Lionel's mind. Dream sense. Lionel's mind split almost 200 ways, each taking control of a different section of his body, as though he was a machine to be operated rather than a human being. Lionel's body began to move with an extreme amount of precision. Even in cases where his muscles couldn't meet the mark, Lionel used his Earth variant affinity to take control of his armor and forcibly pull himself to the proper position. In this state, he had the greatest control over his body and the absolute clearest mind. If Alexander wanted a battle, he would get one. Even at this moment, Lionel could sense the heavy gazes on his back. He could see Gertrude's tearful eyes. He could see Roland's steel jaw. He could see Goggles' clenched fist, Costello's warped polearm, Miles' bleeding lip, Austin's quivering knees. There were hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people reflected onto his mind, each and everyone looking toward him with a light of hope. The burden was heavy, so heavy that he felt it might sink his knees, crush his shoulders and shatter his back. And yet he stood tall, his spear pointed forward. Lionel raised his foot, the space beneath him quaking. In the next instant he vanished, appearing before Alexander. Yet rather than attack, he took a step to the side. As though having read into the future, Alexander's fist punched at empty air, entering a space that would have run through Lionel's chest completely. The air shook, a deep trench tearing through the city below and causing explosion of dirt. Lionel's cold eyes flickered beneath the visor of his helmet, his spear sweeping upward in a motion to slice Alexander's arm off. A shield of force manifested once again. However, Lionel's spear didn't even connect. It shifted through space, continuing toward Alexander's arm as though no shield had been there to begin with. The sight of blade contacting skin played in all their minds. Yet, before anything could happen, Lionel vanished again. In his place, a blast of energy rocked the air, causing concentric circles of energy to radiate out. Lionel appeared again at Alexander's opposing side, his expression, hidden beneath his silver-black helmet, completely unfazed. He had already seen through Alexander's skill as a close combat expert. After entering the fifth dimension, one's ability to control the force in the air around them, as opposed to just the force in their bodies, reaches an all-new level. In that split instant, Alexander had used the jetting out of his elbow to counter Lionel. But only the slightest twitch of the muscle was needed for Lionel to see completely through it. By the time Alexander understood what had happened, Lionel's spear descended again, slashing down on his left arm with full force. PCHU. Lionel's blade cut through Alexander's skin, only to be stopped by his flesh and bone. His spear, which had a sharpness he was keenly aware of, couldn't even take an arm off any longer. Lionel understood the problem. His stamina was already running low. He couldn't afford to fuel every attack with spatial elemental force. At the same time, the stamina he needed to upkeep the use of his divine armor at his current stage didn't allow him the right to use other elemental forces. In the end, he could only rely on his spatial force in this state, but it was simultaneously the most draining force he had. Lionel dodged out of the way of yet another strike, his labored breathing causing puffs of fog in the steadily increasing rainfall. Alexander's figure flickered, completely moving out of the way of Lionel's snaking chain blade. It was clear that he had given up on simply staying in place as the wound on his left arm rapidly healed before their eyes. Alexander didn't say a word. The rumbling universal force around him grew more fervent. Lionel vanished once again. Without a word, Alexander had appeared in the exact location he had been in, his fist eviscerating a quarter of his castle to dust without a care for the nobles that might have died inside. I wonder, how much longer can you keep that up? In that moment, over the horizon, the galloping of 3 purebred horses charged through the rain, entering the battlefield as Lionel and Alexander faced off. Chapter 777. Lionel took heavy, deep breaths. When he first created Dreamscape BattleSense, he never thought that there'd come a day where he would become so proficient at it that his body would give out before his mind did. It almost felt like the greatest irony. Even now, facing a newly advanced fifth-dimensional entity, he was able to read, predict and react to his actions without much issue. And even though it had already been several exchanges, and even though he was using dream sense and splitting his mind and senses almost 200 ways, he had barely used 10% of his dream force stamina. But every time Alexander moved with his spatial domain, every time he threw a punch and forced Lionel to slow him down, it was like another chunk of Lionel's life was taken. If his divine armor was removed now, it might look as though only a skeleton remained. Even his so-called heavy breathing was only heavy to him. By now, he hardly had the strength to take anything more than shallow, quick breaths. To make matters worse, the injuries he had suppressed after getting hit by Alexander the first time seemed to want to flare up again. Lionel's senses had long since locked onto the 3 oryx approaching from the distance. In fact, he had sensed them long before they even came into view. But he really didn't know what to do about it. He couldn't even find a path to deal with Alexander. If these 3 decided to attack his army, he wouldn't be able to help even if he wanted to. A strange helplessness overtook Lionel, as he was forced to dodge again. He coughed violently. Though no blood came out, it felt like searing hot coals were being plunged down his throat. His lungs felt as though they had been lit on fire. Despite his worry, Roland too noticed the charging oryx. Realizing that the problem could become bad, he immediately took charge. Sending numerous signals, the left wing of the army did an about-face, grasping their weapons as they faced the oncoming assault. Alexander! The booming voice rolled over the thunder that quaked the skies. It was deep and held an undeniable majesty to it that resonated with one's heart and soul. Completely ignoring the army before him, the king of the oryx leapt from his steed, bolting through the air with his 2 generals in tow. World force. Lionel smiled bitterly. He had already guessed that the king of the oryx would have the other half of this world's world spirit. But if he really had to deal with 2 world force users, he would really be finished. Could it be that he would never be able to step foot outside of this world? Was all the blood, sweat and tears he had poured into this meaningless? Lionel could almost feel the hearts of his army constrict. Then, as though madmen completely forgetting military law, the entirety of the rebel army surged toward the capital without thought for their safety. General. It didn't matter who it was. Whether it was Rollin all the way down to even the cowardly Goggles. They all seemed to have lost their rationality in that moment. When Lionel saw such a scene, he wasn't sure how to react. With happiness? With rage? The bitter sweetness made him feel as though the weight on his back was still growing heavier. By now, it was heavy enough to make him feel suffocated to an extreme, his heart pumping with a continuous pang. However, Lionel could have never guessed what would happen next. Just as he was preparing for a battle that would likely be his last, the Oryx King and his 2 generals appeared before the indifferent Alexander. As though he had already expected such a result, Alexander punched outward. Eyes steeled with determination, Everard stepped in its path, his mouth sputtering with blood as Alexander's fist shot through his chest. A wild grin painted the Oryx general's face. His claws stretched out, latching onto Alexander's arm as though his life depended on it, the only thing holding him up in the air being the Oryx King's world force. Alexander frowned and was about to pull his arm back, but the Oryx King appeared before cutting down with all the force his halberd could muster. Reacting quickly, Alexander shot a palm forward to block, only for Richet to step in its path. Though his face didn't carry the same wild, bloody grin Everard's had, his eyes had the glint of a madman. This glint, even after his chest was completely pierced through, even while Alexander glared back at him, even while his king's halberd split his head in 2 on the way to Alexander's, never faded. Lionel's heart trembled as he watched the Oryx King's halberd pass through his own general, as though he wasn't there. Everything felt as though it was moving in slow motion. Lionel could see the trembling of the king's hand, he could see the sadness reflected in his eyes, he could see the pain trembling through his soul. The halberd killed an excellent general, only to be stopped by a shield of force manifested through thin air. "Do you really think this is enough to kill me?" Alexander said plainly, gazing upon the Oryx King's halted blade. "No," the Oryx King replied, his hands having grown frighteningly steady. At that moment, Lionel felt the king's gaze lock onto him. He didn't know why this king would choose to look toward him at that moment. But he saw none of the disgust, rage or blame he thought he would find. Instead, all he received was a calm smile. It was the kind of smile that told him to relax, that told him that someone with larger, stronger shoulders than his own would take on this burden for him. And then the Oryx King erupted into flames. Everything around him from his halberd to his generals, to even himself imploded in a massive cascade of world force. Lionel's heart came to a grinding stop. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.